Breakups suck. We all know it. Not long ago, I broke up with my ex of nearly 10 years. It was over long before then, but I have a hard time ending things. She's a sensitive person, and whenever the subject of ending it came up over the years, well, let's just say that she would go into shutdown mode. I realized prolonging the relationship was making it worse, but I didn't understand that at the time. I also want to mention, to protect everyone's privacy, that I won't be using names or locations in the story. I'm still close with the family, and they've already dealt with enough in their life, and I don't want to bring more stress in there. When I finally ended it for good, it went about as well as you can imagine. She took it horribly, and it was a few rough weeks of fighting, crying, and even some threats. But eventually, the split was final. She moved in with her aunt, who lived about an hour away, I think, but I'm not exactly sure. Since I stayed in the house, I ended up giving her a lot of the furniture, which was fine with me. I make decent enough money that I could afford new couches and whatnot. I planned on going to one of the big chains to get all of my new furniture, but in the short term, I needed something in my house to sit on since I was watching TV in a lawn chair. I looked on Marketplace to see if I could find anyone who was just trying to get rid of some furniture. What I found was this super ugly yellow love seat. I know that sounds disgusting, but I have this weird fascination with the color yellow, so I was all about it. But the most exciting thing to me was that the woman was selling it for $40, and it looked like it had never been sat on before. I messaged the woman and set up a time to come see the love seat. She lived about 40 minutes away, but I didn't mind the drive. I drove out to the small house that sat in a sort of semi-secluded area. I knocked on the door, and an elderly woman answered. I told her that I was there for the love seat, and she looked scared. She screamed that she didn't know who I was or what I was talking about, and she slammed the door in my face. I went back to my car and checked the address in my messages. This was clearly the address, so I messaged her and told her that I was there, but a woman closed the door on me. This woman responded several minutes later and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, that's my grandmother. I live in the garage out back. Just walk out back and come on in." I was a little annoyed, but I wanted that love seat, so I made my way to the garage that was in the backyard, as she said. I knocked on the door, and the sort of muffled voice responded, saying, "Come in." So I walked in and looked around, but I didn't see a love seat, and in fact, the inside was just a normal garage. I shouted hello, but I didn't hear an answer. And just as I was about to leave from an adjacent room, a small person seemed to charge me. This figure had enough of a surprise start on me that she was able to jump on me, knocking me off my feet. She was wearing something on her head, and it was dark in the garage, so I wasn't able to see her face. She was yelling and screaming, and finally whatever it was came off. And I saw. It was my ex-girlfriend. I'm not even joking. I was so flabbergasted, and I was able to push her off, and instead of running, I just got up and started yelling at her. Her tone changed instantly from erratic to crying her eyes out. I went over to try and console her, even though I was furious and very, very confused. She was uncontrollably crying. I was trying to calm her down, and that's when it happened. She pulled out like some box cutter or something like that, and just cut my shoulder. In that moment, I screamed, wincing in pain, and ripped the small blade out of my shoulder and just threw it to the ground. I started to howl, and in the 10 years of knowing this woman, I'd never seen her act or sound like this. She grabbed the blade off the ground and started to slash the air in front of me. I think she was trying to make contact with me, but in between all of her sobs, she was just thankfully unsuccessful. I was able to get to my feet, running to my vehicle screaming, and I called the police right away and informed them of what had happened. They showed up pretty quickly, and thank God she was arrested. Getting attacked was horrifying, but watching someone I care about be taken away by the police was incredibly traumatic. The woman I watched get put in the back of the police car was not the same woman I used to love. I still can't believe her plan actually worked. There was no guarantee that I would ever check Marketplace for furniture, but I did. She knew I would be attracted to this ugly yellow couch if I did, and she was right. She told me that she was moving in with her aunt, which was true. Her aunt lived several houses down from that poor elderly woman who had to deal with the fallout of all this nonsense. And the last thing I knew was that she was being moved somewhere to get treatment. I decided not to press criminal charges, and I'm even helping with some of her medical bills. Sometimes it's the people closest to us that can cause us the most harm. I don't know what clicked off in her brain that made attacking me seem like some sort of solution. I feel terrible for her, and I truly hope that she gets all the help that she needs. For anonymity, I'm going to leave out some details from my story that I'm sharing with all of you. All my wife wanted for her 31st birthday was to go on her favorite country artist's summer tour. The average ticket price for even mediocre seats seemed to be over $200, which was surprising to me. I didn't go to many concerts, but I thought it would be cheaper than that. Anyway, I got lucky, and the tour was coming pretty close to our hometown, and I knew that it would be the perfect gift. The tickets were going to be on sale on a Tuesday, and since I was working, I was going to get online and grab them after work. Well, again, my ignorance of the concert scene came into play, and the show sold out almost immediately, and I saw that there was absolutely nothing available when I got home from work. I was texting with one of my buddies, and he told me that I could look on the secondary market for seats, but I would probably have to pay an upcharge. I was excited that there was still a chance, though. I began scrolling through the main sites, StubHub, Vivid Seats, and all those others. After limited success, I switched gears and began looking at Craigslist and Facebook groups and markets to see if I could find anything from a local seller. I sent a few messages out but hadn't really received responses, and the ones that did respond were increasing the price after every message, it seemed like. As the days and weeks rolled on, though, I was getting ready to give up, until I found someone selling 2 tickets for what seemed to be a reasonable price. Their name was Victor, and he had the tickets listed on Facebook Marketplace. I messaged him in a hurry, praying that they were still available. I didn't receive a response in the next half hour or so, and I assumed that they were most likely spoken for. I decided to get some sleep and just went to bed, pretty disappointed. However, when I got up for work the next morning, I had a message from that Victor. He sent the message at around 4 a.m. and said that the tickets were still available. I was ecstatic and asked when I could grab them or meet to pick them up. He replied and said that he had a few other inquiries, so I would need to send the payment via PayPal, and then we could schedule a time to meet up. He was okay with using PayPal goods and services, so I knew my money would be protected if he was trying to scam me. I quickly sent the payment, and he confirmed that it was received. He said that he could send the tickets virtually or provide the physical copy of the tickets if that was preferred, and since it was a gift, I asked if he could meet up for the physical copies, and he said he had no problem with that. We made a plan to meet at a local grocery store at about 8 p.m. so I could get the tickets. I showed up a little early and parked in the back left of the lot as we agreed to. About 50 minutes later, an old Marin Oldsmobile pulled up and sat a few spaces away from my car. I wasn't sure if it was Victor or not, so I just waited. After about 5 minutes, the door to the other car opened, and I asked, "Hey, are you Victor?" And they responded, "Yes. Hi, thank you, I appreciate you buying these for me. Here are your tickets." Now, we small-talked for about a minute or so, and I thanked him and said that they were for my wife's birthday, and we both went our separate ways. I wrapped them up in a box for my wife and gave them to her for her birthday, and she was so excited that we would be going to the concert just a few short weeks later. We get to the concert, and everything was amazing. The seats have a really great view, we've already grabbed some drinks, and we're having a fantastic time. About 15 minutes into one of the opening acts, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, great to see you." And I kid you not, it was Victor. I was like, "Oh, hey, what's going on?" And he responds, "Sorry I'm a little late, the traffic was crazy." Victor reached across me and put his hand out to introduce himself to my wife and said, "I'm really glad you can make it." My wife, who was polite enough, didn't say anything to me immediately, but after saying hello and introducing herself, she pulled me aside and asked who that was. I told her it was the guy that I bought the tickets from. I didn't know that he was going to be there. I thought he was just selling the tickets. Now listen, Victor seemed like a really nice guy, and I had no problem sitting next to him for the entire show while my wife took the aisle seat. But some of his comments throughout the night were pretty confusing. He was making it seem like we had all made this plan to go together, and that we were a group of friends just hanging out. I was polite and tried to answer him every time he said something, but there was definitely a few times that I just tuned it out and enjoyed the show and made sure my wife was having a good time. Anytime he would say I'm really glad we got together or something weird like that, I would just give him a half smile and sort of nod. Clearly there was something wrong with this Victor guy. My wife was having a blast though, and that's what was important to me. As the concert grew to a close, Victor leaned over to both of us and said, "What's next? What do we got planned for the rest of the night?" My wife looked at me confused, and I said, "Hey, I appreciate you selling us the tickets, but we're gonna head home. Have a great night, alright?" I got up and grabbed my jacket as my wife did the same. We started to walk up the aisle, and I felt something grab my arm. It was Victor. And before he could say anything, I said, "Hey, what's wrong with you? I don't even know you, man. Why don't you just leave us alone, alright?" At that moment, I was pretty angry, and after a night of appeasing a complete stranger's notions, I think my patience had grown a little thin. But as we left, I felt bad and regretted having yelled at him. It was pretty late, and my wife and I decided to grab some food on the way home and eat it on the couch before bed. The next few weeks went on as normal. My wife and I were both busy with work and had a ton of things to do around the house with any free time that we had. I remember going to bed really early one night and trying to read to fall asleep when I got a Facebook alert on my phone. It was a message from Victor saying, "Hey, I had a nice time at the concert with you and your wife. I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I'd like to take a chance to, get to know you both better." I deleted that message and I blocked his account instantly. I was now creeped out. I didn't really use social media all that much, and this was why. Weird people on the internet. I'm gonna be honest. The message creeped me out, and it was on my mind a lot over the following days. But eventually, as all things do, it began fading slowly from my mind. About 6 or 7 weeks after the concert, my wife and I were sitting on the couch, messing with our phones, and our dog started going absolutely crazy as there was a loud pounding on the door. Outside of a few immediate family members, we never have anyone over as our Akita is old and not the best at meeting new people. I told my wife to stay where she was, and I would go through the garage to see who it was. As I opened the garage and went towards the front door, my heart sank. I saw that it was the weirdo from Facebook Marketplace, Victor. And I was at a loss for words. But I think I finally muttered out something like, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said something along the lines of, I know, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have showed up unannounced, but I have tickets for next week. The show, and I thought you and your wife might want to go." He had a huge and uncomfortable looking smile on his face. I asked him how the hell he knew where I lived, and he said he got it from the PayPal transaction. I told him that if he ever came to my house or my family again, I'd call the cops and let him meet my 200-pound dogs that he could hear going crazy inside the house. His smile turned to a frown, and he said, "We'll see," and walked away. I took a few moments outside to collect myself and went back inside. My wife asked me who that was, and I told her it was just UPS and that I got another package. For the next few nights, and even weeks, I felt like something was off. I noticed the motion lights going on more frequently. I felt like I heard scratching or creaking outside of doors and windows, but I chalked it all up to the idea that I was just hypersensitive and hyper-focused on some psycho showing up in my house. Thankfully, we hadn't had any additional incidents or run-ins with Victor, but I know that I will never buy anything from Facebook ever again.
Last year, I put my pool table on Facebook Marketplace. I had it in my basement, and it wasn't in the greatest of shape. Plus, I never really used it. It was taking up a lot of space, and I knew I needed to get rid of it. I listed it on Facebook Marketplace for a price that was pretty high. I wasn't in a huge hurry to sell it, but I wanted to get a good price for it. It wasn't a crazy high price, but you could probably find a nicer pool table for a little less if you tried. After listing it, the pool table received no interest. I wasn't surprised, and after a few weeks went by, I got the first message about it. It was a guy named Jim, and he told me right away that he wanted to buy the pool table. We messaged back and forth for a little while, and then made an appointment for Jim to come by and purchase the pool table. I really hadn't expected to sell it for this price, and figured that Jim would try to negotiate when he got to my house. I had a set price in my head that I was willing to go down to. Jim came over at about 6 p.m. on a weeknight after work. When he got to my house, I let him in, and then showed him down to the basement where the pool table was. He looked at it for a few minutes, and then agreed to buy it. I watched him take out all the cash of the full listing price and then give it to me. I was shocked, but more than happy to accept it. I told Jim that it was his now, and I would help him load it into his truck. Luckily, he had a pretty big pickup truck, and it would just fit. It was a bit of a pain to move the coffee table into his truck, but we got it done. He then left, and I felt really good about the price that I had gotten. I truly didn't think that I would be able to sell the table for that much. After this, almost 2 weeks went by. Then, I got a message from Jim. He told me that he felt that he had gotten ripped off, and he could have gotten a better deal. Now, this was over a week later, so I wasn't going to take the table back. I told him it's been over a week, and a deal is a deal. This obviously didn't make Jim very happy. He argued with me for a while, telling me to give him some money back, but I refused. I didn't have to give him anything, and he should have tried to negotiate or looked around for a better deal if he really wanted one. I felt that this wasn't my responsibility to help him out. We ended up leaving the conversation on not a very good note, but I felt that it was over. A few days went by, and Jim didn't reply to me at all. Then, things got strange. My girlfriend was over at my house one night for dinner, and at one point she got up from the table and told me that she saw some guy standing in the front yard. I got up, and we both walked over near the window. When we got there, I didn't see anybody, but I did notice a white truck parked out on the street. I realized that it was Jim's truck. I remembered it from when I helped him load the pool table in it. I told my girlfriend the story of how he was mad about the price. We looked all around the house through the windows, but we couldn't find Jim. We were going from window to window, and when I finally returned to the front of the house, I opened the front door. As I did, I saw the truck starting up and drive away. I decided to message Jim and tell him that I knew he was at my house, but when I went online to do so, he had blocked me. 2 nights later, he was prowling around outside again. This time, I was by myself and in the living room watching TV. I noticed out of the corner of my eye a man walking past the front window. About a minute later, I heard my front doorknob turn, but thankfully, it was locked. I didn't waste any time and I called the police. However, Jim left pretty soon after I did, and he was long gone before the police got there. I told them the whole situation and asked what they could do. After that, I felt confident that the police would be able to look into it and I wouldn't have any problems from Jim again. But the very next morning, as I left my house to go to work, I was walking to my car. Right as I was about 5 feet from my driver's door, I heard somebody sprinting behind me. I looked around to see Jim running at me with full force. I chose to run back into my house instead of going for my car door. This gave me a slight amount of distance on Jim, and I somehow made it inside right before he got to the door. This time, he was really mad. He tried opening my front door and then went to the window when it was locked, and he started banging on my window. I called the police again, who arrived in a very fast time when Jim was still there. He was caught and luckily didn't do any damage to my house. This experience caused me to stop using Facebook Marketplace for the time being. I know there are many good people who use it, but I would recommend anybody to not give out your address and be careful. I'm somebody who enjoys going to thrift stores and occasionally pawn shops. I love saving money and finding good deals. I buy a lot of used items, and I've probably saved lots of money over the years. I occasionally like to browse Facebook Marketplace for good deals on stuff. There usually is. Most of the things I don't want or need, so I don't buy. But every now and then, I find a deal that's too good to pass up. This story takes place about 6 months ago. Up until that point, I had probably purchased about 3 or 4 things on Facebook Marketplace. All of the experiences had been good to that point. As I was scrolling through the items for sale one day, I came across an iPhone. It was unlocked, meaning it could work with any service provider. All you needed was the SIM card. This was 2 generations newer than mine, and it was a very reasonable price. I kinda needed a new phone, plus there were no noticeable problems to it, and it said to be in like-new condition. It was a new listing as well, so I was excited. I tried to jump on it fast. I reached out to the seller, who responded back to me rather quickly. He was a man and was not all that far away. I tried to make arrangements to buy the phone as soon as possible and said whenever he was free would work for me as well. We agreed to meet the next day at a nearby Target store. This was the biggest and most popular store in the area, and it was also close to us both. The next day, I drove to Target with the money, and I was excited to buy my new phone. I knew that I was getting a really good deal. I arrived about 10 minutes before the meeting and went inside Target. After walking around for a while, the time came. I sent a message letting the seller know that I was inside the Target. I was looking around, but I couldn't find him. After about 10 more minutes went by, he finally texted me back. He apologized and said that something had come up and he couldn't make it that night. I was disappointed, but I told him okay, maybe tomorrow. I decided to leave Target then and not get anything. After going back to my car and driving away, I was followed for several miles by a blue 4-door sedan. Of course, I suspected maybe it was the same guy who was selling me the phone, and this was some kind of setup. Maybe I'm paranoid, but when buying things on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, those kind of things always pop into my head. I couldn't tell who was driving the car behind me, but it did look to be a male. I didn't want him following me all the way home, and I decided to pull over on the side of the road. It was a standard and somewhat busy road, and at first, the car behind me started to pull over as well, but when I came to a full stop, he then pulled back onto the road and sped past me. I tried to look inside the car when he passed by, but I didn't get a very good look at all. After the car passed me by, I waited and watched it go out of sight. Then, I got back onto the road and drove the rest of the way back home to my house. After getting back and going inside, it wasn't long before I glanced out the window and happened to see the same car. It was going extremely slow down the road. I ducked down so he wouldn't see me. The car passed by my house and then went out of sight. About a minute later, I saw it driving back from the other direction. It didn't stop at my house or anything, but it was driving really slow. I just hoped that guy didn't know where I lived. After that, I decided to block the seller on Facebook. I had no interest in buying the phone anymore. To this day, I don't know for sure if that was the same person who was following me home or driving down my street. I do think it was the seller from Facebook though. I also don't think he knows my exact address, but he somehow figured out the street that I live on. Either way, nothing strange happened, and I'm glad to say everything's been fine since. Last year, I was selling an old coffee table on Facebook Marketplace. I was only asking $40 for it, and it was in good shape, but it was nothing too special. It was kind of old, so I figured it was a reasonable price. It took a while to receive any kind of interest. After a couple of weeks, though, I did get one person who asked about it. It was a guy named Spike. He asked me if I was willing to do $30 for the table. I said sure. I was happy to get anything for it, and if it didn't sell, I would probably just give it to Goodwill. He asked when would be a good time for him to come over and pick it up, and I told him the next night between 5 and 7 p.m. would be fine if it worked for him. He agreed to the time, and I gave him my address. I was happy to finally get rid of the old table. The next day, I moved my table to right inside my front door so it would be easy for Spike to just grab it and go after paying me. When 5 o'clock came, I hadn't received any kind of messages from Spike, so I assumed that he would be there any time. However, as time went by, it was soon 7 o'clock and Spike didn't show up. I decided to go on Facebook and message Spike to see if he was still coming. When I got onto Facebook though, I saw that Spike had blocked me. This was really confusing. Our conversations had gone great, and I didn't understand why he would do that. Still, I guess he just wouldn't buy my coffee table, and I put it back. I kept the listing up in hopes that maybe somebody else would buy it, but things remained quiet. Fast forward to about a week later. It was a normal weeknight, and I was in my living room. I was just about to get ready for bed, and it was probably like 10 or 11 at night. That's when I heard my back door rattling. I live alone, and I wasn't expecting anybody. Plus, I rarely use the back door. Immediately, I had a bad feeling. I started walking over to my kitchen area, which is in the back of the house and is where the back door is. I was maybe halfway there when I heard the sound of glass breaking. It was also coming from that same area. That's when I froze right where I was, and I turned around and dashed for the hallway. I ran for my bedroom, which had a locking door. I got inside and locked myself in. Meanwhile, in my house, I heard some noises in the kitchen. I knew that somebody had broken in, and my first response once inside my room was to call the police. I tried to be as quiet as I could when doing so. As I was speaking with the 911 operator, I was also hearing footsteps inside. I moved all the way into my closet. I was told that the police would be there as soon as they could. Once I was off the phone with the police, I stopped hearing noises throughout the house. I was in there, being as quiet as I could, and hoping that I did not hear any more noises. Eventually, the police arrived and made their way inside. It wasn't until I was sure it was safe that I left my closet and bedroom. Whoever had been in my house, though, was gone. The police couldn't find them anywhere. I did, however, see the broken window and the damage that it caused. The area was searched, but police never found anybody. That really creeps me out to this day. I really think that it was Spike who broke in. I had just given him my address the week prior, and why would he block me so randomly? I gave the information to the police, but I never got any word if they found him or if it was in fact Spike who broke into my house.
About 4 months ago, we moved into a new house out in the country. Since we previously lived in an apartment, that means that we needed to buy a new lawnmower. Instead of putting out $200 on a brand new lawnmower when we'd probably just have to move again in a couple of years, we decided instead to hire someone to cut our grass for us. We initially went with a guy that my fiance used to work with, but $65 every 2 weeks, well, starts to add up, and I was really looking for something cheaper. That brings me to Charles. Charles had posted in my Facebook classified that he was looking for some lawns that he could cut this weekend, and he had a reputable company, or so I thought. So I decided to send him a message on Facebook. Now, initially, Charles came off as pretty nice to me. He asked me for my address so that he could stop by and give me an estimate. After stopping by my house, he sent me a message that said,
"Damn, sweetheart, you got a big-ass porch."
It made me kind of uncomfortable, but I figured I was just overreacting, and I started planning when he could come out. I told him the days that I was off from work, but he assured me that I didn't have to be there when he would do the work. I told him the best time would probably be on a Wednesday. Wednesday morning, he messaged me.
"Are you home?"
I said no. 3 hours later,
"Are you home yet?"
I told him no yet again and that I won't be home until after 8. Charles then informed me that his tire had a flat and he would come tomorrow instead. Let's cut to Thursday, and first thing in the morning, he sends me a message.
"Will you be home today?"
I told him no. He messages me back a few hours later once again asking if I'm home. I told him, "No, I told you I wouldn't be home all day. Are you still coming out?" Then he tells me his truck broke down. He was sending me messages like,
"Please don't be upset with me, sweetheart."
At this point, I was getting really creeped out and pretty sick of his excuses, but I told him to just come tomorrow. It's now Friday and it's actually my day off, but I woke up and I left the house for the day. He messages me.
"Hey, I'm coming. You're off today, right?"
I told him yes, but that I wouldn't be home.
"When will you be home then?"
I told him I didn't know, and he messages me later saying,
"Sorry, babe. I was loading the equipment onto my truck and it then fell and broke. Maybe I can come tomorrow."
At this point, I was really creeped out and I just told him never mind and that I was gonna find someone else at this point. It's now Saturday and I get off work around 4 or 5 and I check my phone and I find multiple messages from him saying that he cut my grass and that I need to come home and give him the money. I told him no and that I would just send it through Cash App. He started getting really irate with me and saying that I needed to give him the money right now. I told him that I would give him the money once I got home and actually saw that the grass was cut for myself. I'm not gonna lie, I was honestly really worried that he was gonna be waiting at my house for me, so I decided to get a friend of mine to drive home right behind me. Luckily, he wasn't there. I sent him the money and I thought that was the end of it. Fast forward 2 months later. I'm on the phone with my fiance as I drive to class and he tells me that he has to get off the phone because there's somebody walking down our driveway. I asked him what he meant and he said that there was some strange man walking around in our driveway as well as our front yard. After I got to class, he sent me a text telling me that it was some man who was just trying to promote his lawn business. Now, I didn't really think too much about this as it had been 2 months. But later that night, I then got home and I saw a business card that was laying on my counter. And it had the same exact name of the very same man who had been messaging me previously. I decided to call my fiance at work, and I asked how the guy had been acting. He said that Charles seemed genuinely surprised that a man had come out, and he asked if he lived alone. I then asked Mike if Charles had stopped at any of the other houses in the neighborhood, and then he replied with, "You know, now that I think about it, no. After he left our house, he just left." Mike said that Charles seemed really desperate to help around the house, and he actually offered to cut the lawn, fix our porch, as well as remove any trash or scrap metal we had around the house. And then he even asked if we had pests, such as bats in our attic or anything. That especially really freaked me out, as we do have a bat problem, and I had previously posted about it on Facebook, so I'm guessing that's where he figured that out. Mike then said that what was really weird about Charles is how freaked out he was acting about the dog. He had heard our dog Max barking from inside and then started asking a lot of questions like,
Is he big? Does he stay inside or outside? Does he ever go outside, or does he just always stay inside? How big is he? Is he nice?
Mike just chalked it up to him being scared of dogs. He gave him a brief tour of the outside of our house, and then Charles got in his truck and then left. That's when I told Mike that this was the same guy who had been messaging me earlier in the year, and then Mike began to really freak out. He said that Charles had asked a lot of really specific questions about who all lived here and how long they lived here, as well as where they specifically were at the time. He said that he tried to brush them off, but Charles seemed really insistent to know if Mike was the only one in the house. Before he left though, Mike specifically asked him if he had cut the lawn here before, and that maybe he was thinking of the last owners, but Charles just told him,
No, I've never cut your grass before. I just happened to be out this way and thought I'd promote my business.
The worst part? On that day, I had taken my fiance's car to work that day, which means that mine was in the driveway when Charles stopped by, meaning that he thought I was home alone when he stopped by. I didn't contact the police because I thought that I just might be overreacting about it. This all happened about 2 days ago, but hopefully I don't hear from him again. If I do, however, I'll definitely give an update.
When I was 19, I was looking for a room to rent in the city I was moving to for college. It was about an hour away from my family. I wasn't having much luck, and my mom started helping me look for a place. She found an ad on Craigslist for a room for $300 in a house, everything included. The homeowner was a man, and he rented the additional rooms upstairs to other women while he lived in the finished basement. The ad stated he rarely ever saw the other roommates because he had a kitchen and his own entrance downstairs, and that he preferred women because he had issues with male roommates in the past partying and causing damage. We decided to take a look since it was the cheapest that we could find in the area. My mom and I went to the house to view it. Decent house, decent neighborhood. He opened the door and was very welcoming. He was middle-aged and the kitchen and living room were furnished nicely and clean. My mom loves to talk and get to know people, so they were engaged in conversation while I stood there quietly and observed the place. He then said he would show me my room. We head towards the staircase to go up, as I thought, since he said on the phone my room was upstairs with the other roommates, but he opens another door and we follow. He takes us down to the basement and opens a door to a very small room, no closet and no windows. He proceeds to say this is my room and I will be sharing the bathroom in the hallway with him, and his bedroom did not have a door on it. I was definitely thinking absolutely not, this is weird, but they were so deep in conversation that I couldn't interject. He then leads us to the upstairs and shows us the other rooms which the doors were open and says they are currently rented. He then starts telling us elaborate stories about the other women, not very nice stories describing drinking problems. My mom was listening intently, but I took the time to investigate further. I looked in all 3 rooms and the bathrooms. There was furniture, but not a single item in there that looked like it belonged to a woman, no clothes or anything, only men's clothes in one of the closets. He had no problem with me creeping around his tenants' rooms without their permission. I then heard him tell my mom that he has some of his stuff in their closets, but they don't mind. I was feeling really uncomfortable and started moving them back downstairs as they talked. My mom had mentioned when we arrived that her and my dad were going on vacation the next week, but I couldn't go because I had to work. He brought it up again, and that I should come by the next week and have dinner with him and the roomies to see if we would all get along. I said sure, and we left. As soon as we got in the car, I told my mom I would definitely not be living there. She was dumbfounded. I had to explain to her not only did he lie about the room I would be in, that I was not supposed to be in the basement with him as well as share a bathroom with him, and he didn't even have a damn door. But also, did she not notice how no one else even lived there? She still didn't get it and thought I was just being paranoid and thought he was nice and it was a cheap deal. I had to explain it to my stepdad and get him to tell her by no means would I be living there. I tried to report the post, but by the time we got home that day, he removed it. I think he planned on murdering me at dinner, or abducting me and holding me hostage in that basement room that had no way to escape. When I was 21 years old, I broke up with my first ever serious girlfriend, with whom I had been together for 8 months. Needless to say, I was devastated. I fell into a deep depression. I began abusing painkillers and Xanax really heavily, and I began looking for any chick I could find to rebound with. I ended up looking on the personal section on Craigslist and found an ad for a girl named Stephanie. I began talking to her and I arranged for her to come pick me up one night. We had intercourse that night and decided to make it a regular thing. She was an older lady, about 35, and a bigger girl, but she had her own apartment and enough money to keep me loaded on as much drugs and alcohol as I wanted. To be honest, I kind of used this lady and used her as my sugar mama, for lack of a better word. After a while, she grew really attached to me and started to want a more serious relationship. Eventually, she started dropping hints about wanting to get married. She said she wanted to do this to help me out so she could get me on her insurance so I can get help for my drug and alcohol problem, which I refused to consider. One day we got into a big argument and she told the police that I had been abusing her and got a temporary restraining order on me. A week after she did this, she called me crying her eyes out saying, "Please forgive me, I love you," and all this other stuff, and said she wanted to come pick me up, buy me some dope and alcohol, and get me something to eat. Being the addict I am, I of course accepted. From the moment she picked me up, I noticed that she was acting kind of odd. She was usually really talkative and was always on my ass wanting to talk to me about this and that, but on this day she was oddly quiet. When we got back to her apartment, after I walked in, she immediately pushed me on the couch and pulled my pants down and began giving me head. I had been getting bad vibes off of her the whole night, so after this happened, I immediately asked her for a ride back home, which she quickly agreed to do. About 10 minutes after I was home, I got a call on the phone. I picked up the phone, and to my surprise, a lady on the other end said, "This is the St. Louis County Police Department. We're going to need you to come outside to talk to you." I ran downstairs, hid my weed and my pills, and then walked outside to figure out what the hell was going on. When I walked outside, there were about 7 different cops on my porch, and they were all pointing tasers and guns at me. One of them hit me in the back of my leg with a nightstick and put me on the ground, and I was handcuffed. The cops then talked to my mom and got permission to go inside of the house, where they took a drug dog and began doing a thorough search of my room and my basement area. None of the cops on the scene would tell me what was going on. Whenever I would ask a question about why they were there, they told me I would have to talk to the detective at the station. When I got to the police station, I had a bombshell dropped on me. Apparently, this lady had accused me of kidnapping and raping her. She told the police that she had come by my house to return some of my stuff because we had just broken up, and that I had come out, held a knife to her throat, and forced my way into her vehicle, taking her back to her apartment and raping her repeatedly. Thankfully, I had remembered that we made a couple of stops on the way to her apartment. She had gone inside of a gas station to get a couple packs of cigarettes with me, so there was no way that I could have kidnapped her. The police still swabbed my dick for DNA, and they also took my clothes for evidence, and I was forced to spend the night in the St. Louis County Jail wearing nothing but hospital scrubs. I was released the next morning, but my ordeal was far from over. This lady began constantly stalking me. She would call me every night at odd times from blocked numbers and either begin crying into the phone or just beg to talk to me. I also began seeing her vehicle quite a lot in the neighborhood, even though she lives nowhere close to me. I called the police about this a couple of times, but they didn't really seem to care. They told me I would have to go get a restraining order on her in order to make it stop. I wanted nothing to do with the court system though, because I have a criminal record, and I just decided to ignore her and hope that the problem would go away. After a couple of months, she finally did stop bothering me. However, to this day, sometimes I get calls at 2 or 3 in the morning from blocked numbers, and every new girlfriend I get, she messages them on Facebook and tells them how I raped her.
I used to work as an event coordinator at the Swan and Dolphin Resort/Convention Center. Sometimes we'd have to get there at really early hours of the day before the union laborers showed up. This was to get everything ready and set up for special events and stuff like that. One day, one of my managers had cut my hours due to a budget decline in the company. This resulted in me not making as much money as I used to, which caused me to fall behind on rent. Therefore, I had to start making some money until I could either get more hours or find a new job. Eventually, I began to sell some items on sites like Craigslist and eBay, which added to my income. It wasn't much, but it was enough to financially support myself through this time. At the time, I was in the process of selling a specific type of radio from the 40s that was worth a pretty penny. It was my grandpa's radio, and I guess it somehow got passed on to me after he died. I've gotten several offers for it, but the majority of them were people trying to lowball me for prices too small. At one point, however, I get a message from a guy who seemed really interested in it who was willing to offer me $500 for it, which was more than the listed price. I of course accepted the offer, and he then told me that he could come after 5 after he got off work. This was actually better for me, as I'd be out until 4. Anyway, 5 p.m. rolls around, and a few minutes after, I get a knock at the door and open it. Standing at my doorstep is an older-looking man, maybe late 50s, tall, with a long gray beard. To describe him a little better, he looked like a biker you'd commonly see in country movies. In a very deep and raspy voice, he says, "Hey there, I'm here for that radio?" I happily let him in and show him the radio sitting on the kitchen table, and even got him a snack. Oddly enough, he immediately begins inspecting the condition of it, and even went as far as checking the inside. After what felt like forever, he puts it down and says he'd do it for $300 as the condition wasn't the best. Needless to say, of course, that $500 deal was out the window. He then stares at me with this intimidating look where I felt like I didn't have a choice. In the end, I had to agree and did the deal with him right then. Mind you, I'm a petite 5'7" girl, so I wasn't going to try and argue with someone like him. He gives me the money, puts the radio in his car, thanks me, and drives off. I wasn't sure why, but something about him just gave off a negative vibe, which made me glad he was gone. The rest of the night was normal, where I had been watching a movie in my bed when my phone rang. The call was coming from an unknown number, but the area code was the same. Without thinking much of it, I pick up and immediately recognize the voice on the other end. It was the man from earlier calling me to thank me. What he said, however, will forever be burned into the back of my mind. "Hey Sally, look, thank you so much for your hospitality and kindness. If I'm being completely honest with you, I was planning to kill you with a knife I had in my back pocket the second I walked into your house. But you were just so kind, I just couldn't pull myself to do it. Take care now." Right then, my mouth draped open as humanly possible with all these thoughts racing through my mind. If I'm being honest with you, I wasn't sure what to do other than to process as to what I just heard. I would have called the police, but I later found out that the number he was using was fake from an app. That basically meant that even if police were to track the number, it wouldn't lead to him. After that, I removed the listing from Craigslist and never touched the site again. As scary as this was, I never received any updates on his identity or if he's in jail or not. There are seriously some crazy people out in the world who are willing to do anything to you. I emphasize that you please be careful when selling or buying something from sites like Craigslist. You never know who's out there and what they're capable of. This happened when I was in my mid-20s back in 2012 when I was living in Sarasota, Florida. I had just graduated from college and had gotten a job in IT as a software engineer at a really good company. Because of this job, I was able to move out of my parents' house and get an apartment. It wasn't big, but it was spacious enough where I could store most of my stuff. When moving out, odds are you'd probably have a few items left over that you no longer needed or wanted. Well, I had the same situation and had some things I didn't need that I put up for sale on Craigslist. At the time, Craigslist was booming in popularity where people were buying and selling left and right. One of the items I had listed was this large tote I had used back when I played sports. It was in pretty good condition, and I figured I'd snag a deal on it since sports were popular in my town. I'd say within a day, I had gotten a message from someone nearby interested in the tote. He seemed nice, didn't live too far, and was willing to pay more than what I was listing it for. Being so close to me, he'd offered to just meet me at my apartment, which would make for a smoother transaction. I'll be honest, I was a little uncomfortable, knowing that him, a complete stranger, would know where I lived. That being said, I brushed it off and told him I'd do it. Later that night, I hear a knock at the door and was greeted to a man who looked to be in his mid-30s with this Swedish accent. He immediately goes to hug me, telling me that it was a nice way of saying hello in Sweden. Being a gay guy, I didn't really mind it and thought it was a kind gesture. He hugs me for a good 10 seconds before letting go and asking me for the tote. I gladly give it to him, and he then proceeds to pull out a $100 bill and hands it to me, making sure our hands touched. It was a little uncomfortable, but I dismissed it as something people always did in Sweden. He thanks me, hugs me again, and walks down the hallway to the exit. Now let's fast forward till about 2 days later. I happened to be sick on this day and had called off work to rest. As I'm taking a nap in my room, I hear a heavy knocking on my door, which abruptly awoke me. I opened the door and was greeted to 2 police officers and the property manager. Confused, I asked what was going on, to which they then asked if I knew this person. The property manager showed me a photo of a man on his phone who just so happened to be the guy I had sold the tote to. I tell them yes and explained that I had sold him a bag, but that was all I ever knew about him. They take down my name, my description of him, and what he ever said to me or did to me. Whenever I asked why they needed that information, they informed me that they couldn't tell me as of now. That being said, they leave, and it wasn't until a few days later where I had finally gotten my answer. Turns out, the man I had sold the bag to had been wanted for owning 23 terabytes of CP. To put that in perspective, a single terabyte is equivalent to 1,000 gigabytes. This meant that he had about 13,000 hours of content downloaded. When I was told this, I was beyond disgusted, knowing I was talking to a predator, a wanted predator in my home. The tote I had sold him was to keep certain documents that contained information on how to cover his tracks. Obviously, this plan never went through, as he did end up getting caught in the end. I was interviewed for about a week by police before my complete shock slowly got back to normal. After that, I deleted my entire Craigslist account and decided to not sell anything else. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can take this as a learning opportunity to never trust people online. Before I begin with my story, I want to point out that this isn't the type of story to make you jump out of your seat. This is, however, a very real and traumatizing story for me. To preface this, I'm a female, currently 18 years old, and live on a ranch in a very secluded small town in rural Iowa. It mostly consists of multiple farms, lands, fields, etc. I've lived there my whole life and even met some of the people in my town who were very respectful, as it's a quiet little town. I won't mention the name of it as I don't want this getting out there, but it has a population of about 2,000 people. This happened during the summer of 2021 and is by far the most horrifying thing that's ever happened to me. For context, I work at a gun store in my town, which is very safe for the most part. However, I always bike to and from work as both my parents worked late nights in the city and couldn't get me until later in the night. Well, one day, my bike had been stolen by someone from the rack right outside of the shop when I wasn't paying attention. I was obviously pissed because of this and didn't bother contacting the sheriff as they really didn't care what happened around here. Most of the time, they wouldn't take thefts seriously and either half-assed investigated them or claimed that they didn't have enough evidence. With the police no longer being an option, I called my dad telling him the situation and he said he'd come by to get me after work. On the way home that day, he's giving me a lecture throughout the whole car ride about how I was careless. That night, I had been on my computer searching through Craigslist to see if I could find an affordable bike to buy. I didn't need a super expensive bike, just one that would get me from point A to point B. Within 20 minutes, I had found one that seemed like a steal. It was a standard bike that seemed to be in great condition and was only $70. The seller was only 15 miles away from the nearest city, so it was a long drive, but it would be worth it. My parents had been at work that night, and with no car, I had taken an Uber to the drop-off spot. When my ride had dropped me off, I noticed a black van parked on the side of the road with its lights turned off. It was the only vehicle in the area, so I could only assume that was him. I messaged the seller, asking if that was him in the van, to which he then said yes and to come over. I ever so slowly walk over towards the driver's side when I see a man roll down his window and introduced himself as Jeff. He had claimed that he was the one selling the bike and that it was in the back of the van. He then tells me I could go ahead and open the doors and just grab the bike. I then thought to myself as to why he wasn't doing it, and when I asked him this, he said that he had a bad knee and that it hurt to walk. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, I proceeded to walk towards the back of the van where the bike was. As I'm about to open the doors, I can see very faintly from the window a man wearing a vendetta mask staring back at me. The second I noticed him, I instantly knew that this wasn't some exchange and there was definitely no bike. Not making it obvious I noticed him, I told the driver that I didn't need the bike anymore and that he could go. However, I was afraid if he had known I had seen someone else back there and tried my best to stay calm. I start running towards a nearby Walmart when the driver tries negotiating that he'd lower the price. But no matter what he said, I still ignored him, hoping he'd just go away as I knew there was no bike. I approached the Walmart and that's when the van immediately drives away, disappearing into the night. From there, I had spoken with security about the incident and that's when they had called the police. At that point, I explained where I was, what I did, and what was said. As you could imagine, the listing had been taken down, and I never saw it again. I was unable to give a good description of the van, other than the fact that it was black with windows. I had assumed the cops would tell my parents about this, but given that I was 18, the cops couldn't inform them without my consent. I had Ubered back to my house safely, with thankfully nobody following me. Till this day, I'm still unsure as to what that man's intentions were, but they obviously weren't good. I advise anyone thinking to use Craigslist to not do it, as it's not only sketchy, but also dangerous. And for those of you who are gonna do it, I emphasize you please bring someone else along with you. It may just save your life.
This happened about a year ago. I'm a college student and I was basically forced to move out on my own, which I didn't mind, but that meant finding a new roommate, which can be a daunting and scary experience. I've had a few weird encounters, but I think this one takes the cake. I posted an ad on Craigslist looking for a bedroom in a shared house or apartment for $300 or less, and on my ad I mentioned, please no phone calls, only texts or email, because I find being on the phone with someone I haven't had a chance to size up a really uncomfortable situation. I'm just awkward, I guess. Anyway, I got a call from a dude who clearly didn't read the no calls part, which I mentioned because this type of phone call was exactly the reason I don't like to talk to strangers on the phone. At first, he was just pleasant and normal, told me he had a room available and relevant information like that. We started to talk about when and where we'd meet, and he started going on tangents about random stuff. I'm in a combination of too interested in deep conversation and too awkward to end the call when it started to get weird. So this call went on for 2 hours, and we talked about the meaning of life and all kinds of weird stuff like that. Honestly, this should have been the red flag, and I shouldn't have met him. And of course, I also should have grown a pair and told him I needed to leave. So he wants me to meet him at his place and show me the room. I've since learned that you should really insist on meeting in public first. I got to his neighborhood and it was run down on a level that made the ghetto I grew up in look nice. Saggy front porches, hot cracked concrete, sad people with old beat-up Lincolns. You get the picture. His house blended right in. The yard was seriously overgrown and the front door didn't work. I went around the back and just looking at the guy standing in the doorway and seeing the kitchen behind him was enough to make me realize I really just wanted to leave. No way in hell. The guy in the doorway was a man with a sort of clown-style afro. He was leaning on a cane on his right side. His eyes looked crazy, and the house smelled musty from 10 feet away. Again, I'm a coward, so instead of trusting my gut, I go inside, and I'm polite thinking, it's okay, it'll be over in 20 minutes and I can get out. I don't know what made me think this man who had a 2-hour conversation with me on the phone about life and philosophy would let me get away that easily. He took me up a flight of creaky steps into a small bedroom with no door and a mattress on the floor. I thought no way in hell would I live with a 40-something years old man and no door on my bedroom, but it wasn't a moot point because my mind was made up before I even saw the room. I wouldn't have lived there for free, let alone for $200 a month. Things got weird. He tried to hold me hostage with conversation again. I think he was lonely. He talked about how some of his family were millionaires. He might have been delusional. The whole story seemed made up. Then he told me about an 18-year-old girl that has also checked out the room and tried to fuck him, and told me about how his mom hated white people. He was black, I was white, and it sounded like he sympathized with her. Obviously, that was super uncomfortable. Eventually, I was able to find a break in conversation and plucked up the courage to make up an excuse to leave. I was never so happy to leave a place in my life. I don't know if he was necessarily a rapist or anything, but he really gave me the creeps.
Last year, I broke my leg and was unable to do a lot of things that I typically do. I live alone in a smaller house, and my friends and family were really nice in helping me out when I first got the crutches. Soon after, though, I realized that I would have to do yard work, and I didn't want to ask family or friends to do it. Everybody in my neighborhood takes great pride in their yards. The lawns are all very green and trimmed often. There's generally nice flowers in most as well. I have a typical garden, just some basic flowers by the house, and then most of my front yard is just grass that I cut weekly. I decided to go on Craigslist to find somebody to keep up my yard for a few weeks until I would be able to again. There was only 3 weeks until I would be able to do yard work, and I didn't want to hire a company because I knew that would be really expensive. I found an ad on Craigslist that said, "Male just graduated from high school, looking to earn money doing odd jobs during summer." He even listed yard work in the ad, and I figured this would be a good person to go with. I contacted the kid, whose name was Michael. He responded saying that he was excited to have a job for a few weeks, and I told him he would come over once a week. The job would be cutting the grass and watering the flowers, also cutting down weeds if there were any, and picking up sticks in the yard. Probably would only take an hour or 2 each week. The next week, Michael arrived at my house, and I went outside to greet him. Right away, though, things seemed strange. Michael did not appear to be in high school at all. He had a full beard for starters, and I know some high schoolers can grow full beards, but he just didn't look 18 or 19, more like 29 or 30. Right away, I said to Michael that I thought he said he had just graduated high school. He looked confused for a moment and then said that he looks a little older than he actually is. He admitted that he hadn't just graduated, but claimed he forgot to change his ad for a few years. More like 10 years, I thought. Still, he looked capable of doing the work, and he was already here, so I gave him the information that he needed, and he started working. I went inside and went over some work stuff. I was working part-time at home and part-time in the office at the time. Occasionally, I would glance out the window to see what Michael was doing. The first day went pretty well. He did all of the maintenance work in about an hour, and then I paid him, and he left. The next week was a bit different. There was the same amount of work to be done, if not less, but he was there for almost 3 hours. I wasn't quite sure why he took so long, because I wasn't paying him by the hour. But finally, he finished, I paid him, and he left. The next week, which was the last one, he was there for a lengthy amount of time again, and this time, I noticed him poking around some of the windows and areas of my house from the outside. I really didn't know what he was doing. Cleaning the windows was not part of the job. That's seemingly what he was doing, though. I was careful not to let him notice me when I watched him work, but seeing this was a little confusing. At last, he was done, and I paid him for the final time, and he left. I was glad to be done working with Michael. He was a little strange and definitely misrepresented himself. But that same night, at about midnight, I was still awake and on my phone in my bedroom. I'm a bit of a night owl, and I frequently stay up past midnight. I heard the sound of a window opening at the opposite end of my house. Immediately, I knew what was happening. I just knew it had to be Michael. Looking back, I could have been wrong, but I had more than a hunch. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was trying to do, but when I suddenly heard footsteps coming into the house, I knew I had to do something. I stepped out into my hallway, just a couple of steps. Then, I shouted as loud as I could that I knew it was Michael and I had a gun. I didn't have a gun, but I wanted to scare him off. It actually worked, and I heard footsteps moving back until I heard noises around the window again. I left my room and walked into the living room to see an open window. I went to the front of my house and saw what sure enough appeared to be Michael running out of the front yard and onto the street. I made sure that all of my windows and doors were closed, then I went back to bed. The next day, I went to the police with all of my information. It was not difficult at all for them to find Michael because his ad was still on Craigslist. I'm glad I was awake that night when he tried breaking in, or I'm not sure what would have happened.
The whole thing happened back in summer 2016. My parents go on holidays quite often, and I used to stay home alone for 2 weeks at the time to look after our dogs and take care of the garden in general. I've always been a bit of a scaredy cat due to my experiences with being harassed and followed home alone a couple of times. My neighborhood was relatively new at the time, so the whole thing was surrounded by forests, and oftentimes you could come across some junkies lurking in the forest while walking home from shops. However, despite that, I usually felt very safe in my house, staying with 4 big dogs and all. Nothing would ever really happen since most of my neighbors were my dad's friends who were all in the army. For some reason, it gives this odd sense of safety cause who would be stupid enough to try and break in the area like that. Oddly enough, during that particular summer, a couple of break-ins happened on my street, but my parents still decided to leave me home alone, reassuring me I have nothing to worry because I have my dogs, and our house is surrounded by a big fence. My fence has little spikes on top, so it's almost impossible to jump across it without hurting yourself. So, first couple of days were fine. Nothing weird happened except some thuds I heard in my garden, but thought nothing of it since usually it was just martins causing some mischief in my mom's flowers. It would happen so often that even my dogs would ignore it at that point. 2 days passed, and I finally have to leave for shops, but do loads of stuff to do throughout the day. I had to go in the evening when it was getting slightly dark outside. I went shopping, got my stuff, and would walk back home through my usual path. People would usually walk their dogs there, so it was quite busy in the evening because it was something in between a park and a forest. I was just casually walking, minding my own business, texting someone on my phone when I noticed that some guy I passed suddenly stood up from the bench and started walking behind me. But again thought maybe it's someone from my neighborhood that I don't recognize and he's just walking in the same direction as me. So I exit the forest into a normal road where houses start. I live right at the end of it. Guy's still walking behind me. I still think that maybe he lives in one of these houses, but nope. I get to the last junction where my house is, Guy is still behind me, and at this point I know he's not one of my neighbors, so my blood runs cold. Luckily, my neighbor who lives to the left of my house was outside watering his plants and spotted me as I was walking by and started talking to me. So the guy who was walking behind me immediately noticed it and just started running away again towards the forest, which ultimately gave me creeps. He was clearly following me to my house. I called my parents to tell them that it happened, but again, they told me I have nothing to worry about. Our neighborhood is safe. I had my dogs with me and so on and so on. I tried to calm down and go on with my things as usual. Whenever my parents are out of town, I sleep in their bedroom downstairs, since I don't want my dogs to walk the stairs in the dark and possibly hurt themselves. That night, as usual, I was laying in bed, reading a book, my dogs already soundly sleeping in bed with me. I suppose they could sense I was distressed because they usually sleep on the floor around the bed. I heard a thud coming from outside, like a little thud on the window in the room next to mine. Again, thought it's just Martin's, but this one time my dog started growling at the window in my bedroom. Couple seconds of silence, another thud, this time on window in my bedroom. That already made me panic, but I tried to stay calm nonetheless. However, the third got louder, each coming from windows on the ground floor. Someone was banging on every window of my house, making my dogs go absolutely crazy, running around the house wherever the bangs were coming from. At that point, I was in tears, knowing exactly what's happening, so I got out of my bedroom and walked to the center of my house where I can see the main door. And here's the thing, my main door has a window in it so you can see inside. I sat down in the darkness, couple feet away from the door, waiting, hoping and praying that someone will get scared of my dogs barking. But nope, I wasn't this lucky. First, I see my dogs rushing to the door, barking at it before there's anything there, but then I see a black silhouette outside my main door peeking inside and then banging on the little window as I'm sitting there helpless. I moved out of sight, hiding under the table, and got my phone out as I'm still hearing that man trying to break the glass. I called my dad, barely being able to breathe. He didn't pick up. Right, it was like 2 a.m. and they were on holidays. I tried 2 more times until my mom picked up, very confused why I'm calling in the middle of the night. I managed to spit out, "Someone is trying to break in, I don't know what to do." At that point, the man was trying to open the door, banging with his whole body on the frame to the point where my mom could hear it on the call. My dad was frantically trying to call everyone who could come and help me, his brother, my neighbors, my grandma. Everyone was put in a full mobility at that very moment to come here as fast as they could. My neighbor, the same one who spoke to me earlier that day, was the first one to come outside and scare the guy away. He rushed to my garden, but I was still too afraid to open the main door, despite the fact I could see the neighbor standing in front of it. I knew that man was still on my property, but back of the garden was pitch black, and my neighbor didn't want to risk going there on his own and getting potentially knocked out with something heavy. 10 minutes later, my uncle, aunt, and grandma pull up to my house and I can see them all outside. My uncle had a key, so he opened the door, letting my dogs outside so they could chase after the intruder. My dogs are hunting dogs, so they're not cute little puppies for strangers. I will never forget how my grandma and aunt approached me when I was clinging onto the chair, absolutely in tears as my mom was trying to figure out what's happening on the call. The man escaped through the back of the garden into my other neighbor's garden, I'm guessing trying to get away from my dogs, but he was finally gone. He did manage to damage the little window in my main door. The glass was already slightly cracked. Door itself got loose on the door hinges. I don't want to think about what could have happened if they didn't get to my house that quickly. My 2 brothers and I lived with my mom. I'm the oldest of the 3, and my mom generally relied on me to get things done. This naturally turned me into an adult from a very early age. Even to this day, my mom talks about feeling guilty for having to thrust adulthood on me so early on. She thinks that I didn't have a childhood. Maybe she's right. As you might imagine, my dad wasn't really in the picture. He was an abusive drunk. And when I say abusive, I mean seriously abusive. Up until the time I was 10, he lived with us, and whenever he would get drunk, he would beat the living crap out of us. It was always terrifying. The only saving grace was the fact that he wasn't always drunk or had alcohol in the house. In fact, there were sometimes months at a time when he would go without drinking. and he was an otherwise pretty decent person. For all that was wrong with my dad, he would have probably been close to an ideal human being if it had not been for his rampant alcoholism and the demon inside of him that came out when he got drunk. The incident that got my mom to finally divorce him was horrendous. I had been in my room playing video games or something, and he was in the living room. My mom had just gotten home from getting groceries. He accused her of having an affair at the time, and of course this wasn't true, but he didn't believe it. He kept screaming at her that she was lying. It escalated to the point that he pinned her down on the floor and said that he saw her nose growing and then grabbed a screwdriver and cut into my mom's nose with it. There is still a scar from that day. Well, that all went down when I was about 10, so this was about 5 years later. My mom was bringing my 2 younger brothers on some kind of Boy Scout trip. They were both in the Boy Scouts and always felt left out because all the other kids had a dad. My mom's guilt drove her to volunteer and help out whenever she could, so she went with my 2 brothers for this weekend camping trip with the Boy Scouts. She really wanted me to go with them because she felt uncomfortable having me alone in the house. I insisted that I was mature enough to do it, and honestly, I didn't even have friends that I could party with if I wanted to. She eventually gave in and let me have my way. I remember being in my bedroom playing my PlayStation. It was a pretty typical Saturday afternoon, but then I heard a car pull up. I didn't know who it was at first, and I immediately got really panicked that I was going to have to call the cops. My bedroom window doesn't have a really good view of the driveway, so it took me a second, but after studying the part of the car that I could see, I recognized it as my father's car. I was immediately mortified. I was on bad terms with him, and my mom had a really serious restraining order put on him after they had separated. I got really nervous, and I was not sure what to do. He didn't come into the house for a few minutes, and I immediately started wondering what he was up to. I did the only thing that I could think of and cracked my window so I could hear what was going on outside. I thought that if I could hear what he was doing, I would have a better idea. I immediately recognized that he was crying. His whimpering sounded really intense. I hadn't heard from him in years, and my mom said that we would never see him again. But here he was, crying in our driveway. He paced around for a few more minutes before finally standing still. I could hear his crying get louder. Then he screamed, "Pop!" All I heard was a gunshot. The second that I heard the gunshot, I immediately knew what had happened. I ran outside anyway. I looked down at my father's lifeless body on the driveway cement, blood everywhere. As traumatic as it may have been, I didn't cry. I didn't act emotional or anything. I just called the police. They got there a few minutes later and took me into custody. They wanted to keep me safe and secure until they could contact my mom. The rest of the story played out exactly as you would imagine. My mom apologized profusely. I had to answer some questions for the police. Nothing out of the ordinary. I don't really know what to make of the situation. I don't have much sympathy for the guy. Part of me is kind of happy that he killed himself. But looking back, I just kind of wish that he had done it where I wouldn't have had to be a witness. The entire experience made me never want to stay home by myself ever again. It's been a long time since this whole thing had gone down, and even now, if I have to stay home by myself, I will make an effort to leave the house or invite a friend over. I won't stay there alone. A couple of years have passed since this entire situation, and I can't help but think that it was all for the better. My dad was a seriously destructive human being, and I know this might sound horrible, but I wish that he killed himself sooner. For those out there who haven't lived with a toxic and negative parental figure, consider yourself extremely lucky. The tribulations that I had to endure at the hands of my father fostered a lot of rage inside of me. My girlfriend and I had been living in our new apartment approximately 3 or 4 months at the time of this story. For clarification and background, we live in a basement-level unit. The one and only entrance is inside the building and down the stairs. However, there's 4 windows facing nothing but a row of shrubbery and tree line. It was roughly 10 p.m. She was at work for the evening, and I had the place to myself. Lights on and TV blasting, I was sitting in the living room planning on eating trashy and binge-watching the remaining episodes of Broad City. Not long into it, however, I heard a scraping sound from the bathroom. My first thought, a mouse? Which was the last thing we needed. So I get up and make my way through the hallway as quietly as I can to catch a glimpse of it. The closer I got, the more I realized the scratching wasn't coming from the bathroom, but rather the window in the master bedroom. My next guess was it's simply kids playing outside, as they tend to, or the bunny I had seen bouncing out there that morning. Even more likely, someone taking a dog out to pee. I paused, tried to hone my hearing, and only then noticed it wasn't a sound echoing from outside, but rather scratching on the window itself. I started into the bedroom when I noticed the sound stopped and moved to the adjacent window in the room next to it. A smaller bedroom that gave us the creeps as is. We never used it, there's no light source, it simply sits dark and empty aside from a few boxes of my clothing. Now thinking back, it was probably a bad idea. I had hoped upon being discovered that whomever it was, obvious to me now that it was a someone, not a something, would run off. I had caught him red-handed, so I steeled myself and yelled out, "I hear you! What do you want?" The scratching stopped instantly. I waited. After what felt like an eternity, I assumed the coast was clear. I made my way to the windowsill and slowly cracked open the blinds. I don't know why I did, because there he crouched, peering into me with the widest and wildest eyes I've ever seen on a person, most certainly strung out on something. He told me to let him in. As shocked as I was, I almost laughed at the audacity, as if I was just going to swing open the window and let him in. Using the remaining courage I had mustered, I tell him not so gently, "No, get the fuck away from my house." He again told me to let him in, to which I informed him I was calling the police and hurriedly proceeded to do just that. I even turned the phone to face him for added effect. Unfortunately, it had the exact opposite effect. He was seething, raging, and practically foaming at the mouth. He drew back and punched the window, repeatedly slamming his fists and palms against the glass. The window started cracking, blood flinging up like a gore-filled movie effect. I was out of there fast, heart racing, slamming the door shut behind me. So tempted to run out the front door, but incredibly scared that he would just come around the front of the building. It would take no time at all for him to do. Torn and trapped, I pick up the nearest blunt object and placed myself in between the two doors. I figured whichever one moved first, I'd go out the other. I still had the phone to my ear, urging the 911 operator to get someone here fast. In my panicked state, I also feared for my girlfriend who would be coming home soon. I messaged her warning her about what was going on. Eventually, sirens and a pounding came to the front door. The police had arrived. I explained what had happened, and they searched the apartment and area near the window, coming back with a set of keys that he had possibly dropped, but no sign of him other than the broken window. They took a sample from the blood splatter on what was left of the glass. My girlfriend came home shortly after, having left work early and calling the police herself. I'm grateful she did. Maintenance had been notified, and they threw up temporary boarding until it could be repaired. They never actually found the guy. Or if they did, I never received any updates about it. Definitely didn't get any sleep that night.
The story happened about 3 months ago in January, and it still really creeps me out to this day. I'm 17 years old, and my mom and stepdad had left me home alone for 6 days, as they had planned a trip to Mexico to celebrate their wedding anniversary. I was having so much fun being home alone. I was going out and partying pretty much every day without my parents ever knowing. I should also mention that my mom had actually hid her car keys from me, but obviously, I had found them. I was also driving around and seeing my girlfriend at the time as well. There was one night where I drove to her house. She lived about 20 minutes away from me, and it really wasn't a very safe area. It was also a school night, but I'd stayed at her house until about 1 a.m. Well, as I was headed back home, I began to notice a car that was following me. I managed to lose them when I took a back way home though. Once I got home, I took a shower, and it was almost 2 a.m. at this point, but my dogs were barking really loudly and aggressively. They usually never bark like that. Well, I start looking through the blinds to see what the hell's going on outside to cause them to bark this much. As I peeked through the blinds, I saw a black car outside. What the f? I say to myself. That's the same exact car that was following me earlier. As you can imagine, I start to internally freak out. I then see two people walk through my backyard. I run and lock all of the doors and windows, and I close the curtains. I then heard a voice of what sounded like an older man, and he had a very deep voice. What I heard him say still gives me chills to this day. It sounded like he was on the phone with someone. This is how the conversation went.
Yeah, we're here. The parents are gone. I think it's a young boy here. If I had to guess, he's around 17 to 18 years old. Yeah, don't worry. We're gonna try and take him soon.
I then hear them trying to open every door and window, all the while my dogs continue to bark inside my room with me. Then, something clicked in my head. I have an older next door neighbor who's very big into guns and home protection. I knew if I was able to get his attention, he'd help me. I then zoomed to the front door, ran outside, and started screaming and banging on my neighbor's door, telling him everything that's happened thus far. Now, you would probably think by now these guys would either 1, be gone by now, or 2, at least made it inside the house. But no, these idiot criminals were still in my backyard. So anyways, I go with my neighbor to my backyard with him carrying a gun, and the guys are there, to which my neighbor then proceeds to scream his ass off at them, pointing his gun at them, and telling them they have 5 seconds to get the fuck off the property, or he's going to blast them. Also, I wanted to mention that there was 3 of them, which I didn't know before while I was still in the house. They all then proceeded to book it out of the backyard, then got into their car and drove off. But not before my neighbor got their license plate, then called the cops on their asses. I'm still to this day so fucking grateful for my neighbor David for doing what he did for me that night, as I truly have no idea what would have happened to me if he didn't come help me. Side note, for anyone wondering why I didn't just call the cops myself that night, well, the reason's pretty simple. I didn't want to get my parents in any kind of trouble, or have them find out about that experience and then I get in trouble. So yeah, they still don't know that it happened, and my neighbor David hasn't said anything either. Thank God. Still though, I cannot believe 3 strange men tried to kidnap a teenage boy. You usually hear about this stuff happening to girls very often, but boys? Not so much. Anyways, that's my story. I'm forever grateful to my neighbor David for helping me out that night. Seriously, thank God for him. My story is a hard one to tell, but I really need to get it off my chest. My name is Alexander. I'm a 19-year-old male who's from a very rural county in Texas. My county was very large, however was full of farm fields and cattle, while also only having one little town inside, and it itself was very small. It's one of those towns that if you were to drive down the street, you would for sure see at least 4 to 5 people that you know. Anyway, within our town, we had your stereotypical abandoned homes that everyone would claim different scary things to, such as ghosts, murders, etc. You know, the classics. Well, when I was 15, someone had bought and moved into one of these houses, and it really surprised the town, as this house in question was incredibly old. Like, it's literally been there since before the Civil War, and everyone thought that it would never be bought again. Yet here's this guy that came out of nowhere and bought the house. My father, being part of the mayor's office, was very questionable about this man, as apparently after years later learning this, he had no identification with him, so it's pretty surprising to know that he somehow bought this house. Anyway, one night while my parents were on the couch, they told me that they were going west for a week, and they were gonna leave me home alone. I was really excited about this, as my girlfriend at the time and I were starting to get more intimate, and this was the perfect opportunity for us. Fast forward a couple of weeks and into the home alone a week itself, and I'm sitting on the couch watching TV. As I'm sitting there, I flip to the local news channel, and I see that an escaped convict who was wanted for breaking and entering, sexual assault, pedophilia, and murder, and he had been spotted a couple of months ago just a few counties over. My mind then immediately flashed to the guy that randomly appeared and moved to the old abandoned home. That's when I got a notification that someone was at the door from the Ring app. I went to the door and opened it to see my girlfriend. Her and I made some food and then proceeded to get intimate. I won't go into details, but it didn't take long before we went to my room. As we're, doing this, I hear my phone go off, seeing another notification from the Ring app. I pretty much just ignored it, thinking it was just a deer or something, since they're pretty common in the area. But then, we heard a knock at the door. We both shot up from the bed, thinking it was her parents, after then realizing it was almost 2 a.m. That's when I checked my phone, and in my horror, I saw the guy that lived in the abandoned home on the camera. He was just standing in front of the door, peering inside through the window on the top of the door frame. My girlfriend and I quickly got dressed, then moved into the living room. I stood in front of the door very quietly, and I began to listen. Now, when I tell you this guy was breathing really loud, I mean it. He was breathing loud, like so loud that I could actually hear it from the other side of the door. Then after a few minutes, he began to knock. The knocking then turned into banging after maybe a couple of seconds, and he began to scream that he knew we were there, and he then demanded us to open the door. That's when I then went into fight or flight mode, and I shuffled my girlfriend up the stairs. I then went into my dad's office, which was on the second floor, and I grabbed a handgun from the cabinet. My dad had taught me all about gun safety, so I knew what I was doing. I walked into my parents' room where my girlfriend was sitting, and she was absolutely bawling her eyes out at this point. I yelled at her to calm down and to call the police, and then go hide in my parents' closet. That's when we heard a window break downstairs, and then heard him scream.
You two better hope I don't find you, because I'm gonna hurt the both of you, and I'm gonna make you watch.
This alone told me the man's intentions, so I primed the handgun, and I pointed it right at the door, as my girlfriend was now calling the police. Just then, the door to my parents' room started to bang, as he was now trying to open it. I then screamed, "I have a handgun pointed to the door, and if you don't leave right now, I'm gonna pull the fucking trigger." The banging then stopped, and what followed scared the living shit out of me. The man then proceeded to laugh and then say,
Good, I have one of my own.
I aimed my weapon right at the door, and I was preparing myself, when I then heard the police sirens in the distance. I then heard the man on the other side quickly shuffle down the stairs and then out the door. The police arrived and questioned us and kept us company. My parents ended up flying home later that night and made a promise that they would never let this happen again. We moved not too long after that to Ohio, as my dad's company had an office in Columbus. The scary part, however, is after all these years, I decided to do some research, and I learned that the man was never actually caught, and that he was last seen on that night. I really hope that after what he did to me, he at least left the country, or he was finally killed trying to break into someone else's home. But even to the time I'm writing this, there's still really a part of me that really wishes I had pulled that trigger.
This happened when I was home alone as a kid. It was the summertime, and I was home during summer break. Both my parents were at work, and I think I was about 12 years old. I have an older brother, and he went to one of his friends' houses that day. When I was home alone, I would just hang out and do whatever. Usually, I would go on the computer that we had and play Minecraft or something like that. It was probably sometime in the early afternoon, and I had been on the computer in the living room for a while. I moved into the kitchen to get something to eat. The kitchen was at the back side of the house, and we lived in a split level. I will also mention that the neighborhood was pretty average and a little bit on the quieter side. It was when I was standing in the kitchen that I saw something out the window. I just barely saw movement at first, but it looked like somebody was walking by. I moved over to another window to see. That's when I saw a man walking to the back side of the house. He was wearing a sort of construction vest and had a hat on. I realized that it must be the meter reader. I remember that they came around every so often to our house. I calmed down almost immediately. I had been a little worried seeing a guy walking into our backyard. He went to the very back side of our house and near one of the basement windows. I went back to finding some food in the kitchen. After I was in the kitchen for a good 5 minutes though, I looked over and noticed that the guy was still there. Usually, they would come and go really quick and only be there for like a minute at most. I went back into the living room to go back on the computer, but a short time later, I just had the feeling that I should get up and make sure that the man was now gone. Maybe it was because I was home alone and a kid, so I was a little bit paranoid. I carefully walked back over to the window and could see that the man was actually still there. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't tell exactly what he was doing because I could only see part of him from the angle that I was at, which was higher up than he was. He seemed to be doing something and was near the basement window, but I couldn't tell what exactly he was doing. I thought about going downstairs and looking out of that window, but I knew that the man would see me right away if I did. I went to walk over to another window upstairs, which would have a better angle, but I had to be careful so the guy wouldn't see me. Unfortunately, I really messed up. As I was walking over, I accidentally hit a can that was near the edge of a counter in the kitchen. I knocked it over and it fell onto the ground. This made a loud noise, and the next thing I knew, I saw the man quickly walking away. He moved back to the side of the house. I moved to the front of the house, and I watched the man casually walking down the street until I could no longer see him. I felt like he was really suspicious. I questioned whether he was even a meter reader or not. Why would he leave so suddenly like that? For the most part, though, I was just happy that he was now gone. I went back to the computer. I stayed there for the most part until my brother and parents came back home. When they did, I didn't even think to tell them about the guy that had been there. I thought he was gone for good. My brother's bedroom, as well as mine, happened to be in the basement, and my parents' bedroom was upstairs. Because it was summertime, we would stay up pretty much as late as we wanted. I remember that on this night, my parents went to bed, and my brother went down to his bedroom. I stayed up and was on the computer. All of the lights in the house were off, except for a small lamp in the living room near me. I stayed up on the computer until I got really tired, which was probably at about 1 a.m. Then, I turned off the lamp and went downstairs to go to bed. When I got downstairs, I had to walk past a little living room that was in the basement in order to get to my bedroom. As I was walking past, I happened to see something in the window. The man was back. I could only see a figure of a man, but I could guess who it was. This was the same window that he had been at earlier in the day. I then heard noises coming from the window, as if it was going to come open. I was suddenly really afraid. It was really dark down there, and I hit the light switch, which I happened to be really close to. When this happened, it lit up the whole room, and I could no longer see the man very well. I heard some noise from right outside the window though, and then it sounded like he was running away. I went running as well, but back upstairs into my parents' bedroom. I knocked on their door and yelled for them to wake up. About a minute later, my dad came out asking what was going on. By the time I explained it all, the man was long gone. My dad went out and inspected the house all around though. He was able to find that the back window the man kept messing with had quite a bit of damage. It had almost came off. It was like the man had been trying to remove the window and get inside the house, and he was really close to succeeding. After that night though, the man never came back. I remember being really scared for a while that he would, and I slept upstairs on the couch because I felt safer there. Luckily, he never did.
This happened in April of 2018. I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated, and in a pretty good neighborhood. But the security isn't the best. Sometimes the gates are left open, and anyone can piggyback off someone else entering with an access code. Twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins, or other items being stolen off porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So on this particular Friday, I went to bed around 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble going to sleep. So I put on a podcast to listen to, and I eventually start dozing off. I heard a clicking sound. I thought it might have been the upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kind of zoned this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on the weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realize the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then began focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly, it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leapt out of bed and head for the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, as if somebody is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is being inserted into the lock, and the person is trying to jimmy it back and forth. I instinctively turned around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 pistol, and loaded a 14-round magazine, and chambered it with a hollow point round. I then head back to the front door. As I exit my bedroom, I see the lock twist. I immediately aimed my gun, knowing that if somebody came through, I would have to make a split-second decision. I decided that if somebody comes through the door, I would give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they did anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. The inside latch lock prevented them from entering. When I first moved in, I remember thinking that the latch lock was a good security measure, and I had gotten into the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life or death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. On the other side were 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 were wearing hoodies, and it was difficult to make out their faces. The men seemed to have objects in their hands, but I couldn't make out exactly what. The 2 men were talking back and forth, possibly trying to figure out why they couldn't open the door, even though they had successfully opened the outside lock. The woman was also talking very loudly. Anyone in the hallway would have been able to hear her voice. She was speaking in another language. The only words I could make out were, "Apartment 250. And she kept repeating that over and over again, like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open the lock, you have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or given it to anyone. Here's another thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, that apartment number does not exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from my door, I took a long broom handle and jab it hard into the surface of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stopped playing around with the lock and took off running. I debated whether or not to call 911 and decided against it, unless they came back. I know that they're going to be long gone by the time anyone gets here, and it would have been too risky to try and follow them to get a better description or a license plate. I didn't have enough identifying information. I filed a police report the next day and gave my apartment manager a heads up. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and asked for a police presence for the next couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that wasn't a surprise to me. Nobody else in the apartment has ever reported anything similar happening. One precaution I took was to replace the latch with a smart lock, so it could always be locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that a latch was the only thing preventing an armed confrontation between myself and the intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in situations like this until it actually happens. If one good thing came out of this, I feel confident that I responded in the right way and was ready for the unthinkable.
This happened back in 2016, and I'm still getting over all of the grief. I haven't really shared this story with anyone yet, but I finally decided to share it. I'm not even going to say where this happened for privacy reasons, even though I've since moved,
I'm really afraid that the people related to those responsible might come after me. Anyway, at the time it happened, it was in August, and it was during the evening. My brother and I lived in a small 2-bed, 1-bath home that sat on 10 acres of land. It was what I once considered my dream home paradise. We had everything I could have ever wanted. A good amount of land, a 2-car garage, a pole barn, and a nice view from our back deck. Now, here's some important details to note. The house itself was a basic square with the back deck on the southwest corner of the house. It was notched in the corner of the house with 2 walls on either side forming the corner of the house. You couldn't see around the house unless you bent over the railing, and you could only see the west and southwest away from the house. The garage was on the south side of the deck, which was only a few feet away from the deck, and the driveway leading to the garage was in front, so you couldn't see anyone coming up the driveway from the back of the house. Anyway, it was the evening. I was sitting on the back deck smoking a joint, and my brother was in his bedroom. I was just outside enjoying the weather and the peace and tranquility of the area. Suddenly, all of that was shattered when I then heard my brother shouting, followed by 4 loud gunshots. I immediately jumped up and I looked around the wall of the house towards the window of my brother's room, which faces the backyard. I looked just in time to see 3 masked men hopping out of the window. They appeared to be black, and they looked like they were in their late 30s at least. But they were wearing masks, so I couldn't really see their faces. One of them looked at me and froze, almost like he wasn't expecting me to be there. The 3 then turned and ran around the north wall of the house towards the front yard. I threw my joint out, and I ran inside the house through the kitchen. I then went down the hall to my brother's bedroom. The door was open, and I went inside. When I did so, I stopped dead in my tracks, and my heart then froze. My blood went cold as ice. There on the bed was my brother. He was just laying there, facing up emotionless, with his eyes wide open, bleeding to death. Now, what I did next probably wasn't very smart, but I ran to the living room, and I grabbed one of my guns. I threw open the front door just in time to see a blue Chevy Caprice peeling out of the driveway. I fired 3 shots at them, 1 missing, 1 hitting the car's tire, and 1 hitting the back window. I must have hit one of the guys inside because I had heard someone screaming from the car. Looking back, this probably wasn't a good idea to do since there was a house right across the street, and I could have accidentally shot the neighbor's house, but I wasn't really thinking that at the time. Anyway, the car sped off, and I ran back inside. I grabbed some towels to try and go cover the wound on my brother's chest, while also calling 911. While trying to cover up the wound, I was telling the dispatcher everything that happened, and I knew that my brother was already gone because he had no pulse when I checked, and he had 3 bullet holes in his chest. But I think I was just in disbelief at the time. Anyway, since this area has almost no crime rate, you can bet your ass that every sheriff and ambulance in the county was there in about 15 minutes. I had to explain to the detective that was there what happened while trying not to break down and crying. The sheriff and detective were both in disbelief too, since nothing like this had ever happened in the area in over 37 years. I'll spare you all the little details, but over the next 3 months, the investigation eventually wrapped up. And here's what I learned. After the police had gone through my brother's phone, they found that he had apparently been getting death threats. Apparently, he had been hitting on a girl that was a gang member's girlfriend. Apparently, the guy had warned my brother to stay away from her, and even after he did, I guess he decided that he still needed to get rid of my brother for good. Apparently, the night before he was killed, he had received a message from an unknown person saying,
"I'm coming for you."
Somehow the guy found out where we lived and brought 2 guys with him to do the job. The strangest thing, though, is we lived 40 minutes away from the gang's territory, which was in the city. This guy was so aggravated at my brother that he drove himself and 2 other guys 40 minutes out into the countryside just to kill him.
It really amazes me just how far this guy was willing to go, just to make sure nobody ever went near his girlfriend. Now let me tell you what happened to those 3 guys. One of them was the one that I had shot as the car pulled out of the driveway, and he apparently died while in the car. The other guy who was along for the job was caught during a traffic stop. Apparently he was dumb enough to take that same car out the next day, and there was an alert out for it. Now, since there aren't that many sky blue Chevy Caprices left, it was pretty easy to find. He was arrested, and he was charged with murder, and since the prosecutors where the murder happened are way more strict, he was sentenced to death. The guy who orchestrated this whole thing was actually killed in another shooting in his own city the following week. Yeah, pretty crazy how karma gets to you. I think they all got what they deserved in the end, in my opinion anyways. I did have to go to court for the guy I shot, because he had no family apparently. And due to some other circumstances, I didn't go to jail. I did get a hefty fine though for dangerous use of a firearm, probably due to the fact that I could have accidentally shot my neighbor's house, and I had to take a gun training class after that. But I didn't care. For almost a year after this all happened, I didn't do anything except mope around my house, and I barely even left the house at all. I never even went into my brother's room after that. I just left the door to it closed so I wouldn't be tempted to look in it. I was so devastated by what happened that I nearly lost interest in everything. I ended up just packing up all my things and moving out shortly after. I just couldn't stand to be there anymore, nor did I feel safe there anymore after what happened. My brother and I were really close, and to lose a loved one so tragically and suddenly in your own home is devastating. It was sad because I really loved that house, and my brother. I honestly thought it would be our forever home, but I just couldn't stand to be there anymore. I moved 8 hours away, and I haven't been back to that house since, and I honestly don't think I ever will. I do still own the house and the land. I just don't think I can ever go back. And even though I moved, I still won't ever forget that evening and everything that happened. I'm doing a little better now, and I have someone else living with me, but I'll definitely be scarred for life for that event.
I live in a small city, and nothing much exciting happens around here, especially in my neighborhood. It's pretty rare to even see a car pass by after 10 p.m. I am a 21-year-old male, and I spend most nights playing video games or reading. I rent a 2-bedroom apartment under my parents' house with my sister and her 3-year-old son. She doesn't stay home most nights, and my dad works 2 hours away from home, so generally, I'm alone from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. The street I live on gets really dark, and my house is the last one on this end. From my house to the crossroad is about the distance of a football field. The first time I saw the flashlight guy was about a month and a half ago. As I said before, the neighborhood shuts down by 10, so it seemed odd when I went out for a smoke and saw a man dressed in all black with his hood pulled up walking down my street. But I brushed it off as I finished my cigarette and went back inside. I went to my bedroom and began reading a book. 15 minutes later, I see a flashlight beam sweep through my windows. I should mention that one whole wall of my bedroom is all windows. At this point, I was pretty unnerved, so I put down my book and went to go check things out. I didn't see anything at first, so I chalked it up to me being paranoid and sat back down. But it wasn't long before it happened again. By now, I knew that something was wrong, and I had a really bad feeling in my stomach. I just wanted to ignore it and hope it would just go away. But I urged myself to be a man and look out the window. Looking outside, I noticed the man from earlier, standing about 15 feet away, shining his flashlight directly in front of him. He wasn't moving. I stood there for a couple of minutes, wondering what the hell he was doing, until he swept his flashlight across the whole downstairs of my house As I said before, no one besides me was home. I was pretty creeped out by this point, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I went upstairs and through the door that separates my apartment from my dad's, and went to his room to grab the shotgun. When I got back downstairs and looked out the window, the man was gone. I stayed up for the rest of that night, checking every 10 minutes to see if he would come back. This has happened twice more, and he always does the same thing. Sweeps his flashlight through my house and then just stands there. I've gotten to where I always sleep with my dad's shotgun next to my bed. My dad says that it's weird and tells me to stay inside whenever I see him and to call the cops if I feel threatened. Anybody that does this kind of thing obviously doesn't have the best intentions, so I understandably feel a bit more threatened every time he shows back up. Fast forward to 2 days ago. Once again, I'm all by myself. My microwave is broken, so I've been making it a habit to go upstairs and use the kitchen whenever I'm by myself. I forgot to mention that the only door out of my apartment besides going through the garage is in my room. This is important to remember. I made myself some food and went back downstairs. When I got into my room, it was freezing cold. I live in Vermont, so this time of year I always left my door shut and locked and put a towel under it. I use the garage to go in and out of the house because as soon as I open my door, all the heat escapes my room. I always keep the heat cranked all winter because my room is the coldest in the entire house. When I looked at my thermostat, it was shut off. I turned it back up, and I was really unnerved because I had just turned it up about an hour ago. As I said before, I never turn it off because of how cold my room gets. I felt a breeze on my back, and I turned around to see my door partially opened. I quickly close and lock it. But not before I peeked outside, and sure enough, I saw the flashlight guy's light go out as he turns the corner at the end of my street. The next day I told one of my neighbors about what happened, and they told me just a couple of weeks prior, a woman that lives in the same neighborhood was alone, watching TV with her daughter, when someone broke in. I guess they heard the intruder coming through the door and locked themselves in their bathroom and called the cops. Whoever broke in must have taken off when he heard the sirens, because when the police got there, the back door was wide open and nobody was in the house. I don't know who this flashlight guy is, or what the hell he went into my bedroom for, but at this point, as you can imagine, it's got me on edge. Since the other night, nothing more has happened. I've been keeping a light on outside, and a couple more throughout the house during nights, so it doesn't look like I'm the only one here at night from now on. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially when there were clouds blocking the moonlight. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I exited my car, I caught the faint whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, but I didn't see anybody outside, so I ignored it and went in. I just got off my shift with a few hours overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 o'clock yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later. I was sure that I heard a noise inside of my house. I wasn't worried right away, because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work. I even gave him a spare key. However, he would always text me beforehand, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen blinded me. These were the days before phones had light sensors that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright that I could use it as a flashlight. I squinted my eyes and could make out that it was 9-something in the morning, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread message in my inbox or not. I set down my phone and called out my friend's name. There was a couple of seconds of silence, followed by a loud footfall as someone started moving through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I opened the door and stepped inside. The house had 3 rooms upstairs, the bedroom that I was in, and a spare, with a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in my ceiling and hoist myself inside. I had just started to lift myself up when the person came barging out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside the attic when my bedroom door flew open. I heard the footsteps run into my room and then stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which had boxes stacked in the corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone was hiding, it would be in the first bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic, just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they began to climb up. From my vantage point, I could see from about their knees down. They were wearing a dirty pair of blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn-out work boots. After a few seconds of looking around my closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration. The scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me too much of my stepfather, who would shout in a similar way whenever he lost his temper. He would eventually be committed to a mental hospital. The man inside of my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed hidden in the attic. I left my cell phone by my bed when I ran for the closet. I wasn't certain if I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the cops. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped over my bed, I assume in some attempt to find me. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I used my landline to call the cops. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but that was something I expected. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxes and cans had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing that was missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked my house from top to bottom. They found out that the side door had been forced open by a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along the fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke meth. So whoever it was had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me that I should stay with friends and family for the rest of that night and get the door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep and moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next few hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence where the police had found the cigarette butts, but I never saw anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. I lived there for another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, except now I go to a crawl space in the back of my closet. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been just a bit slower, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom before making his way to my bedroom.
When I was about 15, my family and I moved into a large house. It was a relatively new home with 3 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a garage, and even a large basement. Both of my parents were in the upper medical industry and worked several hours of the week. This meant that I would be home alone for the majority of the time while they were gone. I loved staying alone as I like to think of myself as mature and adult-like. At the time, we lived in somewhat of a rural area of Knoxville, Tennessee. Those who have been to or live in Knoxville will probably relate to what I'm talking about. While it was a nice city, the crime rate was high, and during this story, I got a taste of what that looks like. One evening, I had come home from school and my parents were at work. Unfortunately, this was around the time where COVID was still rampant, so my parents had to work extra. 15-year-old me immediately hops onto Call of Duty to cure my boredom. I play some matches for a few hours or so before going up to my room and taking a nap. I'd say I slept for a good 2 hours or so before I awoke to a noise from the kitchen. Looking back, it kinda sounded like a clanking noise you'd hear when moving stuff around. I wake up and take a look at my clock. It was around 7 p.m. I was genuinely annoyed from this noise and put on my slides and went downstairs to see what it was. I ever so slowly turned the corner and what I saw chilled me to the bone. There, in the kitchen, was a woman going through our fridge. She had her back toward me, so she couldn't see me or know that I was there. To provide a little more detail, she was not at all a pleasant-looking woman. She looked homeless, and looking back, I'm pretty sure she was. She wore torn shorts, a tank top, and some sort of wristband. I put my hands over my mouth and slowly went back upstairs. As much as I wanted and needed to call the police, I couldn't as the only home phone we had was near the kitchen. Instead, I thought of another idea. My parents were friends with the neighbors from down the road, so I'd figured I'd go there and call the police. Now, I obviously couldn't have gone through the front door, so I did what anyone else would do. I opened my bedroom window and climbed out while gathering up the courage to fall. When I finally did, I hit the ground with only a sprained ankle and made my way over to the neighbors where I explained what happened. They, of course, instantly let me in to use their phone to call 911. In the meantime, they made a call to the hospital my parents worked at. The police ended up coming a lot faster than I thought and entered my house. Within a minute, they came out with an old, tired, lanky woman in handcuffs. However, she didn't try to get away or resist arrest. She seemed somewhat neutral about it, as if she had accepted her defeat. As it turns out, my theory was correct after all. She was a dangerous homeless woman who had broken into several homes in the area. My parents had come home soon after, where they had spoke with the police, where they then recommended we get cameras. And that's exactly what we did. The next day, my dad went out and installed a high-tech security system around the house. Surprisingly enough, the story didn't end there. It wasn't until a few nights ago where I had brought up the incident to my mom and asked if she remembered about it. Her eyes went wide with this look of fear and worry. When I asked what the matter was, she sat me down, held my hands, and said she was going to tell me something I didn't know. When her and my dad were talking to the cops that day, the cops had mentioned something that would shock them to their core. When they had entered my house, they had found a woman standing outside of my bedroom door. In her hand was one of our kitchen knives that she appeared to have been gripping tightly. Let's just say that if I hadn't jumped out of my window, things probably wouldn't have ended well for me. Thankfully, we hadn't had any break-ins as of today, and I hope it stays that way.
It was around 11 at night and I had just finished working out at the gym. I went to the grocery store to pick up some food for the next couple of days. While at the grocery store, I decided to get $120 cash back, money that I owed my mom, and unbeknownst to me, as I left the grocery store, money that I came so close to losing. Instead of going straight home, I decided to go for a little drive. I just got my car not long ago and the novelty of driving stick hasn't worn off yet. After about a half hour of driving around the city, I decided it's about time to head home. As I pass a gas station on the edge of town, but close to my house, I decide that now's a good time as any to pull in and fuel up. I pull in, and I'm the only one at the gas station. I'm in an industrial business part of town, the edge like I said, so there isn't much around. There's an empty lot that's without light beside the gas station, and I notice an SUV sitting there about 100 to 200 meters away, but I don't think much of it. I get out and start pumping gas when I notice a woman come around the corner and walk straight towards me. As soon as I notice her, a shiver ran down my spine. I instinctively locked my car. She walked towards me quickly, hands in her pockets, staring at me pretty intensely the whole time.
I got in a fight with my boyfriend and he left me here. Can you give me a ride to my mom's house?
She said casually in a raspy smoker's voice. Another chill ran down my spine as she repeated the question, word for word almost, in the same raspy voice. I have to pump gas first, I said to her, keeping my eyes on her the whole time. She walked around to the passenger side door. Beside me, fuel port is on the passenger side and grabs onto the door handle.
Can you unlock your car? I'm cold. I've been here a while.
I have to pay for the gas, I said. Deciding to cut the gas pumping short, I walked inside and talked to the guy behind the counter. I told him the girl outside was kind of suspicious and I didn't know her. He just kind of shrugged and I could tell he wasn't interested in getting involved, so I walked out. I figured she was high or something, but I would find a way to just get her to leave me alone. As I walk out, the SUV that I had mentioned earlier started up. I watched the driver maneuver himself so he could just drive out the exit. He stopped, engine still rolling. He was still like 100 meters away.
Can you open the door now? I'm really cold.
So many alarm bells were going off in my head already. First, she just looked sort of sketchy. She was dressed well enough, but her face was pretty rough. She was pretty covered in makeup, but it didn't hide a nasty-looking sore on her lip. Her sunken eyes were dull, bloodshot, and just dead-looking. Second, she didn't seem like a damsel in distress, not at all. She didn't seem upset, and she spoke without much emotion.
No, that's not my problem. I need to go home,
I said to her, as firmly as I could.
Come on, you're driving me home, right?
I can't. I have to get home right now. Reaching for my phone, I realized I had left it in the car.
I'm cold. I've been out here for hours,
she shouts, pretty angrily for someone who's asking a favor, I thought. Then I noticed her look at the SUV. I started cluing into what was going on and raised my voice a bit.
That's not my problem.
I'm at the driver's side door now.
I'm freezing. You said you'd drive me home. That's not my problem.
I started raising my voice. She started raising hers. We weren't yelling, but it was getting a little heated. We went back and forth like that for a couple of minutes. My mind was racing. I thought about losing my car and about getting stabbed or shot, about getting robbed for the $120 I had in my wallet. I just lost it on her.
Get the back. You do not know who I am. Get the back right now.
I think I caught her off guard or something because she stepped back right away.
You better get out of here right now then,
she said, walking backwards. I was out of fight mode and into flight mode. I watched her until she got a decent distance away, noticing she was walking sort of towards the SUV. I didn't watch for much longer. I hopped in my car and peeled the fuck out of there. I turned into a random subdivision, making sure I wasn't being followed. I called the cops and they said they'd send a car, but there wasn't much that they could do because there was no real crime committed. But I did the right thing, and she was most likely bait for some kind of robbery. I drove home as quick as I could. About 10 years ago, I worked for a short time at a small gas station close by to my house. Both of my kids had started school, and we always needed extra money. I was about 26 or 27 and had not ever really worked anywhere before, but it was fun. We stayed a little busy throughout the day, as there were 3 factories very close by, and would get a lot of our traffic from the employees there, especially at shift change times. One weekday mid-morning, I was working by myself, which was unusual, but my manager, who usually worked days with me, was out sick. No big deal. It was no more than I could handle. There were people in and out all morning, and nothing out of the ordinary was happening, until a transfer truck pulls in and parks to the side of the building. We didn't carry diesel fuel, but it wasn't unusual to have big trucks pull in for drinks, bathroom, or whatever. The driver walks in. Tall guy, not unattractive, but a little creepy looking. He had a huge refillable coffee mug and asked me if there was fresh coffee and if he could fill up his mug. I told him no problem. He fills his mug and comes up to pay and starts chit-chatting. He told me that he had a delivery for one of the factories up the street and asked what would be the best way to get in there, so I told him. No big deal, happens all the time. He then started telling me how he was from Arkansas and that after he dropped his load, he was headed back home for a few days. I was just politely nodding my head. Then he asked me if there was a restroom. I told him yes and pointed to where it was, but did not come out from behind the counter. He starts trying to chat with me again without going to the restroom. He asked me if I was working alone, and that's when all kinds of signals started going off in my head. I told him my coworker had to run an errand and would be back right away. He winds up staying in there for about 20 minutes, trying to small talk, and asked me at least 6 or 7 times where the restroom is. During this time, customers were coming in and out, and when someone would come in, he would walk around the store, kind of behind the shelves. At this point, I'm trying to stay calm and figure out what I need to do to get him the hell out of here. I looked out at the gas pumps and saw a man from one of the factories up the street on a forklift filling it with gas. When he comes in, I was trying to start a conversation and ask him stupid questions to get him to look at my face so I could gesture where creepy guy was standing behind the potato chips. He didn't catch the hint until he walked out of the door and turned back to look at me, and I mouthed to him, "Help me." He turns around and comes back in, and by this time creepy guy had come out from behind the potato chips. Forklift guy asks me if I am okay, and I tell him no. He asks if I needed help, and I say yes. All of this being said very low where creepy guy cannot hear. All of a sudden, forklift guy runs around the chips, slams creepy guy into the Coke cooler, telling him that the lady wants him to leave and to get the fuck out. Creepy guy runs out, jumps into his truck, and hightails it out of there, while forklift guy stays with me until I call the police, and they get there. I make a report, gave my best description I could, called a coworker to come and stay with me, and the police and forklift guy leave. About an hour later, one of the cops come back in to tell me that they caught the guy speeding on the highway leading out of town. He not only had an empty trailer on the back of his truck, he had not been to drop off his load, he didn't even leave in that direction, and no way did he have time to get to the factory, unload, and get back out to where he was pulled over in that amount of time. But he also had a pistol that had been reported stolen in Alabama, and had just been released from prison where he had served 2 years for rape and was wanted in Missouri for not reporting into his probation officer after being released. I have no clue why he was in a transfer truck or what the hell he was doing in small-town Georgia, but he clearly was making his rounds through the Southeast.
A few years back, I was on a road trip by myself. I was driving across about 3 different states to go home and visit my parents and some other family. I had made the trip a couple of times before since I had started living where I was. The drive took a total of about 7 hours, so I would do it all in one day, but it was still a really long drive. On the day that I left, I was able to get out of work a couple of hours early, which was nice. The drive went well for the most part. I stopped for gas a few times, and food as well. At about 9 p.m., I found myself around 2 hours away from my parents' house. My car was running low on gas, and I was running low on energy, so I pulled off the freeway for what would probably be my final stop. After I got off the freeway, I drove down a quieter road for maybe a mile before seeing a gas station. It was a 7-Eleven, and I pulled in and drove up to a pump. The gas station was very quiet, and nobody else was there that I was aware of. After filling my tank, I started walking inside to get an energy drink or something. When I was headed towards the door, I noticed that there was a man kind of standing in a darker area on the side of the building. I went inside and went to the drinks. I found something with some caffeine and then went over and paid for it. Nobody else was inside the store other than the employee. After leaving, I was heading back to my car, which was still at the pump. When I got inside, I cracked open my drink and took a few sips. I was casually looking around and drinking when I noticed the man who had been standing at the side of the building. He was suddenly walking over to me, and the way he was walking was really aggressive. Based on the fact that a random guy who had been standing around the side of a gas station was rushing towards me, I decided to leave. I quickly started up my car and began driving away. When I pulled out, the man was probably within 20 feet of me. I was happy to get out of there, but I noticed the man start running to the back of the parking lot of the gas station, where a smaller, old-looking red car had been parked. I had assumed that car was the employee's. I saw the man get in, and I was now driving down off the road, headed back for the freeway. The guy started speeding away, almost recklessly. He caught up with me rather quickly, and I hadn't been driving slow either, but I wasn't going to risk getting a speeding ticket. Now I was really concerned. I had no clue who this guy was. I was not aware of any reason at all for him to follow me. I soon merged back onto the freeway and started driving down it. The guy behind me was right on my tail the entire time. The freeway was pretty quiet, but there were a couple of other cars and trucks here and there. As I drove, I switched lanes a few times. The guy behind me would always copy me and do exactly the same. The following distance that he maintained the whole time was probably like 1 car length or so. It made me really uncomfortable. After driving on the freeway for probably 5 minutes, I decided to take an exit. I exited at the very last second, hoping it would confuse the man. When I did, the guy pulled off right behind me. I slowed down when I got up to a quieter street, and when I came to the stop sign, I thought the guy was going to crash into the back of me. I drove down another quiet road and passed by a gas station and a fast food restaurant that was closed. Now, I was in what looked like a quiet small town with lots of farmland nearby. I really didn't know exactly where I was. I turned at a random road and then turned again at another one a short time later. I didn't really know where I was going or what I was doing. I was just hoping that the guy would stop following me. Maybe if he realized that I knew he was following me and I was just going to keep turning all the time, he would give up. But the guy didn't seem like he wanted to do that. I drove around this random small city for like 10 minutes. The guy kept up behind me the entire time. I was about to turn around and go back to the freeway when I noticed something. I was driving on what appeared to be one of the main roads of the city that I was in. When I was driving down it, I noticed we were coming up on a police station. I saw some of the patrol cars parked in the parking lot and I decided to pull in. I signaled to turn, and at first, the guy behind me did the same. But as I was pulling in, he suddenly veered around me and sped away, going straight instead. When I got into the parking lot, I saw an officer and figured I would tell him about what had happened. After speaking with him and letting him know, I went back on my way. The rest of the way home, I never saw the guy again. To this day, I don't know why he chose to follow me. I'm a female and a former 7-Eleven employee. I worked there 2 years ago for a span of about 6 months. During that time, I was finishing up my education. I mostly worked overnight shifts there, which were fine with me. Sure, being alone at nights is a little strange sometimes, but hardly anybody would come in. For the most part, it was easy. One night, I was working like any other. I sat behind the counter, going on my phone and listening to music. I had been alone, all by myself, with no customers, for probably an hour. A few people had gotten gas, but none of them came inside. The time was probably 2 o'clock in the morning. Then, I suddenly heard the door opening and saw a guy walking in. I hadn't seen a car pull in, and the gas station is not really at a location where people walk to. He walked in and came up to me at the counter. I said hi to him and asked him how I could help. The man asked me where the beer was, and I pointed to the back of the store where they were. We also had some cases sitting around, which I pointed out as well. The man looked around and then walked to the back of the store. I kept sitting there and then went back on my phone. A few minutes later, the man came back up to me at the counter. This guy was sort of tall and thin, was balding, and looked to be in his 40s or 50s. When he came back to the counter, he was not holding any beer. The guy said to me that he liked my tattoos and pointed to my arms. Then he just kind of stood there. I said thanks and asked if he needed help with something. The guy just stared at me for a second and then kind of wandered out of the store. He seemed a little bit off to me, and after he left, I just went back to minding my own business. I had a coworker coming in at 5 a.m., and I would be getting off at 6. Over the next hour, I only had one other customer come inside and pay for gas. At about 3 a.m., I suddenly noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was coming from the window near the front door. When I looked, I saw the guy who had been inside earlier, who had seemed a little bit off. He was looking inside and pressing his face up against the glass window. The look on his face was rather disturbing and creepy. He was looking straight at me as well. I looked at him and then looked away. I wasn't amused by this. It seemed really weird. When I looked back over again about a minute later, he was still there. I tried to just ignore it, but then he started knocking on the window. This guy had to be crazy or something. I decided to get up and ask the man what he was doing and probably tell him to leave as well. I got out from behind the counter and walked over. I opened up the front door to the building, but as soon as I opened it, the man started sprinting away at what appeared to be full speed. He ran all the way past the road and out of my sight. Oh well, I thought, and went back inside to work, shaking my head. For the next few hours, things were peaceful and went on like normal. At 5, my coworker Alex showed up, and things were really easy then. And at 6, I was off for the day and could finally leave. When I was walking out to my car in the parking lot, I happened to notice the man again. He was standing kind of in the grass between the parking lot and the road. The guy was looking right at me. I hurried up and got inside my car and left. After I left, I called my coworker Alex and let him know about the guy just to be aware. Luckily, the man didn't follow me out of the parking lot when I left or anything like that. Now, fast forward 2 days. I worked one of the 2 days and didn't come across the man or anything strange. But on the second day, I was hanging out with a few friends. There's a diner in town that we hang out at a lot. We're friends with the owner and their family, and my friends and I have been going there for years. I was there, sitting in a booth with 2 other friends. We were just hanging out, talking, and having some food. Out of nowhere, I happened to notice the guy who had been at the gas station. He was sitting by himself on the other side of the diner. The whole place wasn't very big. It had maybe like 10 booths and then seats at the diner. The guy was facing me, and I caught him staring. I told my friends about him and who he was. We weren't really sure what to do, though. I felt like the chances of this being a coincidence were really slim. But still, he wasn't bothering me and hadn't come up to me or anything like that, so I decided to just ignore it. The man never tried talking to me or anything. When I left, he didn't follow me outside either. For the next few days, the man was completely absent from my life, and that's the way I would have liked it to stay. But then came the last time that I saw the man. It was a typical work shift, and for 90% of it, everything went fine. I didn't see the guy and had dealt with mostly normal customers. When my coworker Alex came in the early morning like he often did, he let me know that it looked like someone was messing around near my car in the parking lot. I walked over to the window and looked. That same guy was appearing to try and open one of my windows or something. It looked like he had some kind of tool as well. I opened the door and yelled out to him, asking what he was doing. The guy looked at me and then ran off down the street. It was so strange. I went over and looked, but luckily he hadn't broken in, at least not yet. After that though, I never saw the guy again. I only worked at the 7-Eleven for about another month after that. Gas stations in the middle of the night can be a weird place. A few months back, I was driving home from visiting some friends. I didn't time out the drive very well, and I found myself on the road at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. I still had a ways to go, but I had lots of caffeine and was doing fine. When my car was starting to run out of gas, I decided to stop at the next place. I took an exit when I saw a sign that there would be a 7-Eleven at the next one. They're usually a good gas station, and I go there all the time. When I pulled in, there was another car getting gas and somebody else in the parking lot. I pulled up to one of the pumps at the south side of it, sort of far away from the building. I paid at the pump and then began fueling my car. As I stood near the car, the other person getting gas drove off. This revealed that there was just one guy now, and he was standing near some of the other gas pumps about 20 feet away, but there were no other cars there. About a minute into me fueling my car, I saw the man start to walk over and approach me. He had a beard and wore kind of baggy and dirty clothes. He walked right up to me, which made me a little bit nervous. When he reached me, he asked me if I had a cigarette he could borrow. I told the guy no. I didn't smoke, and even if I did, I certainly wasn't going to give him a cigarette right next to a gas pump. There are literally signs everywhere that say no smoking. The guy stood there looking at me for a moment or two after I had answered him. Then, he turned away and started walking. He walked back over to another pump as I continued to fill my tank, which always takes a long time. Then, out of seemingly nowhere, the man yelled something and punched a gas pump. It made a loud noise. He hit it a few times, which was really disturbing to see. Then, he angrily started walking over towards the convenience store. He got next to it, where they had rocks up against the building. The man proceeded to grab a few rocks in his hands and start throwing them in my direction. He missed badly with the first couple, but he started walking closer. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had no idea why he was doing this. I quickly stopped getting gas and got inside of my car. A rock actually hit my car after I had gotten back inside. I drove off with the man still firing rocks in my direction. When I was out of there and back on the road, I called the police to report him. I was afraid for whoever was working inside the 7-Eleven, or if anybody else would try to get gas there. They let me know that they would have an officer there shortly to check out the situation. I really hoped that nobody was hurt and everything was resolved. The man definitely seemed like he was on some sort of drugs. He certainly was not in his right mind. It's a pretty scary experience that I will never forget, and I hope the man and everybody else are okay. This story happened back when I was younger. I was about 10 or 11 at the time. During that time period, I lived with my parents in a smaller house near the city. We would often walk to a few stores or gas stations to get things. I would go with one of my older siblings a lot, and there were several places within walking distance. This was on July 11th, because on 7-Eleven they used to give out free Slurpees. I'm not sure if they still do or not, but my older sister asked me if I wanted to go with and get one. Of course, I said yes. We walked there down the sidewalk, which took maybe 10 minutes. It was sometime in the afternoon, maybe even the early evening if I remember correct. When we arrived, I went straight for the Slurpees, and my sister did as well. There were a few other people all around inside, and I had to wait for somebody else to get a Slurpee. My sister and I got them, and then my sister went to the back of the store to go look at something else. I went to go see if there were any good snacks that I wanted, so I went in a different aisle. When I was there, a woman started walking down that aisle. She was holding a small dog. As she approached, she noticed me looking at the dog. It was one of those dogs that's extremely small. She asked me if I liked her dog, and I said yes. I thought it was really cute. The woman then asked me if I would watch her dog for a minute while she used the bathroom. I said that I would, and the woman then asked me if I could actually watch it outside. She said that the dog sometimes didn't like to be held by strangers, and she didn't want to get in trouble for walking it around inside. It seemed fine to me, and I said yes. We both then walked outside of the building. The woman started walking over to a small grass area that was next to the 7-Eleven building. The area was really small, but I guess was a good place for the dog to walk around. Before we got there, though, there was this van parked in the last parking space before the grass area. A man was standing in front of it. He suddenly reached out and grabbed me as I was passing by. He held both of my arms, and the woman then told me to get inside of the van. The side door to it was already open. I didn't want to, but the man was much stronger than me and was pushing me in the direction of it. Everything was happening really fast, and I didn't know what to do. It was then that I heard my sister's voice. She was basically yelling and screaming and told them to let me go. This caught the attention of 2 other people nearby, and they started to look over. The guy finally let me go then. Him and the woman's attention now shifted to trying to get away. I ran back over to my sister, who was just outside the front door of the 7-Eleven, as the man and woman got inside the van and sped off. I remember somebody yelling to call the police as they sped off, and another person yelling to get the license plate number. My sister and I went back inside and waited until the police got there. My parents were called and came down and picked us up after we were done answering questions. It was a really scary experience. Luckily, the man and woman were both located later in the day. I still can't believe that I was almost kidnapped. Every time I think about it, it gives me the creeps.
It was a somewhat nippy autumn night, and I was about halfway into my shift. I was a young man, and I took up any job I really could at the time. In this case, it was the late shift at 7-Eleven. In the United States, 7-Elevens are open 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. This meant that someone had to take up that horrid night shift, and that person was me. As much as the job messed up my sleep schedule, it did help me do my coursework during the day, and it did pay a bit better than the normal shifts. I've been told that working in a convenience store is among the most dangerous jobs in the States, and this claim was honestly understandable. Although my city is decently safe, the people who go to 7-Elevens late at night are a lot different than your normal shopper. From what I saw, it was either crazy crackheads higher than a kite, or a bunch of drunken teenagers falling all over the place trying to make another booze run. This was extremely annoying. My coworker Colin and I were largely responsible for kicking these people out. And while it was an inconvenience, it never got truly out of hand or unsafe. This all changed one Thursday night, however. My coworker Colin had some sort of family emergency to take care of, and this resulted in him having to skip a few shifts. This meant that I was in charge of handling the dreaded 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift completely alone. This truly annoyed me. Colin was a really chill guy. His conversations made the hours go by much faster, and without him, I'd just be alone in some dirty store in the middle of the night. Regardless, I received my orders from my manager, and I had to do what I had to do. I arrived at my shift around 5 minutes late as usual, and things were initially going by completely normal. The people that walked in consisted of the usual late-night shoppers and people in their pajamas stopping for gas last minute. It seemed like a completely normal weekday night at first. But then, a little past the midnight hour, things got really strange. It was 12:15 at night, and I was sitting on my small chair next to the counter. I had just plugged in my phone into a charger, as it was running low on battery from using it all night, and that's when I noticed a car pull up to one of the pumps. It was a large black SUV. The windows in the back were either completely shattered, or lazily replaced with cardboard and duct tape. A tall and rather large-built man stepped out in a trench coat and boots. He turned over to the front door of the store and started to calmly approach it. I just kept glancing at my phone, however. Most people walk in, quickly get something, and leave. There was no need for formalities at this hour. "You call this customer service?" the man said in a low, husky voice. It took me a second or two to process that. The people who come in here, especially at this time, aren't exactly expecting award-winning service. "Oh, sorry, sir. Is there anything I can get for you?" The man just laughed. "Oh, kid, there's nothing you can get for me. But there is something you can do." At first, I thought the man was going to ask for some weird sexual favor. Funnily enough, I'd been asked this before while I was on the job. You see, I'm not a young man like you. My joints, they don't function like they used to. And you see my car over there? Well, it could use a wash and fill. The man's attitude and overall demeanor were really weird. The way the guy was talking was unsettling as it is. I mean, if the guy could walk all the way over here just fine, why couldn't he fill his own gas or wash his own windshield? However, state law says I have to assist any handicapped or impaired customers if they request it. There was no handicapped sticker on the man's car, or any sign that he was disabled in any way. But hey, if they request it, I have to help them. Alright sir, give me a moment, I replied as I placed my phone to the side. I then turned on the pump from my control panel and started heading towards the car. Look at those youthful muscles work. I love to see it. For whatever reason, I ignored the man's creepiness and continued heading towards the car. The sooner I cleaned his windshield and filled his tank, the sooner he'd be out of there. At least that's what I hoped. As I stepped out of the building, the man seemed to remain in the store. He seemed to be browsing up and down the shelves or something. Whatever. I got to the vehicle, and sure enough, the gas cap was wide open and ready for me. As I was filling the van with gas, I couldn't help but think about what the man said. He seemed honestly fine and was totally capable of putting a nozzle in the gas tank. It made me wonder why I was even out there in the first place. But hell, if I could just get this weirdo out of there, I could get back inside to just messing around with my phone. After about a minute or two, the tank was full, and it was time for me to wash the man's windshield. As I stepped around towards the back of the van, however, I heard the back door shut. As weird as this was, keep in mind the car was really beaten down and old. It's kind of expected for a car like that to make weird noises, especially on a windy night like this one. I quickly pulled out the sponge and squeegee and started to get to work. But as I was cleaning the glass, that's when I felt it. The discomfort, the odd sensation of being watched or stalked. As I turned around, I felt a hand go over my eyes, and soon my mouth. I barely had any time to comprehend what was even happening. 1 second I was cleaning glass, and the next I was being headlocked. I then heard the familiar sound of the front door to the store opening, and heavy footsteps coming my way. Too many thoughts were racing through my head at this moment, but somehow, somewhere, I mustered everything I had and flung myself as back hard as I could. The person holding me down crashed into the gas pump and shrieked in pain. "Damn it, Carl," the tall man said. I rolled back onto my feet and sprinted as hard as I could, my breath getting heavier and heavier every large stride I made. I managed to run across into a neighborhood and dive into the bushes, slowly peeping my head out to see if they were still following me in the van. After the longest 10 or so minutes of my life, my adrenaline died down, and I finally got the courage to step out of the bush. Just as I was about to call my manager and then the cops, it hit me. My phone was still in the store charging. Thankfully, however, a close friend of mine lived in the neighborhood I ran away towards. I knocked on his door and told him everything. Naturally, we called the police. When we went back to the station after the police told us they'd arrived, my manager was already there. Somehow, my manager and the police were as or more surprised than I was. Things like this rarely happen in my city. We always considered it a safe place. The police immediately looked through the CCTV footage as my manager suggested, and what we saw shocked us even more. When I had stepped out to wash and fill the van, the man jumped over the counter and tried to find and disable the security cameras in their footage. He couldn't manage to do this, so he just stepped outside and decided that deleting the footage wasn't worth all the time. We managed to capture the men's faces on video right after I made my escape. We then submitted the footage to the higher level police to see what was happening. It turns out, the men were known human traffickers and were on the run from previous kidnappings. The license plate on the van seemed to be fraudulent or stolen, as the numbers only matched a completely different vehicle on the other side of the state. The investigators believed that the men stopped by my city on the way to somewhere else, as they figured it was a safer area and people wouldn't expect them to be there. I quit my job at 7-Eleven immediately after that. The event scarred me. Every time I stepped into another gas station, I would always get reminded of how I almost got kidnapped. Needless to say, I would never pick up a job like that again.
Hi, Joel. This is my first time writing to you, and since this is a very sensitive topic in my old hometown, I'd rather remain anonymous if that's okay with you. I had a friend back in elementary school, not my closest friend, but we moved in the same circles, and at one point she invited me over to her house for a sleepover. I was only too happy to accept. It sounded fun. But little did I know it was a night that would have some seriously far-reaching implications. So this friend of mine, we'll call her Annie, lived with her mom and stepdad. They seemed like nice enough folks, and their place was nice enough, but I guess a lot of us come to learn as we grow older, appearances can be deceptive. On the night of the sleepover, her mom wasn't due home until later in the evening. This meant that we were in the care of my friend's stepdad, and because of our bedtime, we weren't likely to see her mom until the following morning. This was no big deal to me at all, but it was to my friend, who kept bringing it up at odd moments while we were playing. It also became increasingly obvious that she didn't really like her stepdad at all that much, which I guess is about par for the course for some children of divorce, so I didn't really read into it all that much. But then came bedtime. We got into our PJs, brushed our teeth, and went back to Annie's bedroom to climb into bed. I asked if she had a nightlight or anything and went to turn off the bedroom's main light, but she stopped me, telling me that her stepdad would be up soon to check on us. Only when he made sure that we were tucked in bed would we be allowed to turn the nightlight on and talk for a while. It seemed like a weirdly strict way of doing things, but I figured that I better just respect their systems, so I lay down on the blow-up mattress that they'd put down for me and got tucked in. I remember talking to Annie about something. I can't remember what exactly, but the conversation took this sudden turn when, out of nowhere, she said, "I'm real glad you're here tonight, Sarah. Thank you for sleeping over." I guess from how it looks on paper, that sounds like a pretty wholesome moment, right? But that just makes me wish y'all could actually hear Annie saying those words, because the way her voice sounded gave them a distinctly unsettling feel. It was almost like my presence was going to prevent something bad from happening, and at the time, I figured that bad thing was just Annie being lonely on a Friday night. She also wasn't the most popular girl around, and I think it played on her insecurities, so it made sense that our friendship meant a lot to her. But in truth, there was a whole other reason she was glad I was there. I remember me and Annie hearing her stepdad walking up the stairs and her swiftly laying back in bed with the covers up to her chin. Now, looking back on it, there was a kind of military precision to it. Annie seemed nervous, like she was focused to pass some kind of inspection, which is exactly what I assumed was going on. I figured if her stepdad was that strict, I better do her a solid and just act likewise, so I did. I lay back down on the blow-up mattress and pulled the covers up to my chin. Annie's stepdad then walked into the room, and instead of carrying himself like some drill sergeant, he seemed perfectly warm and friendly, just like he'd been all evening. Then he walks over to Annie's bed to take a seat on the edge and leans in to give her a goodnight kiss. Only instead of a quick peck on the cheek or forehead before standing up again, he lingers a little too long after the kiss itself. It didn't strike me as being wrong or anything, just weird. Then, as he started to whisper something to Annie, she said aloud, "I want to talk to Sarah." I remember thinking, so talk to me, I'm right here. Like the whole situation just seemed really off to me for some reason, and I couldn't figure out why. I knew different families did things differently. I guess I was just too naive to recognize something that would have seemed obvious if I'd seen it today. So as I'd said, Annie had thrown out some vague ultimatum, which signaled to her stepdad to leave. He shifted a little, looked back at me for a moment with a smile, then turned back to start whispering something to Annie again. She cuts him off even more assertively that time, saying, "Dad, I want to talk to Sarah, please." There was a brief pause, and then he said, "Okay, sweetie." And after that, he finally left the room. Like I said, I knew that I just witnessed something significant, I just didn't know what. But the vibe in the room afterwards was very intense. Annie stayed quiet for a long time. Then, when she finally spoke, she said that same heartwarming, creepy kind of thing. "I'm glad you're here tonight, Sarah. Thank you for sleeping over." I didn't sleep over at Annie's house again. I think she knew that her stepdad had kinda creeped me out that night, but we stayed friends for the remainder of elementary school, and she even came over to play for a few times during the summer after graduation. Sadly, our friendship was basically doomed because we were headed for different middle schools once summer break was over. We kept in touch for a little while, but by the end of that first year, we had all but drifted apart completely. Over the next 2 years or so, I saw Annie around town a number of times. We were always happy to see each other, but the final few times that we bumped into one another, Annie had started to look increasingly unwell. She didn't look like she was eating or sleeping very much, but insisted that she was fine when I asked her. I just wished her all the best, then carried on shopping for track shoes with my mom. About 4 months go by, and I don't see or hear anything of Annie. And then, probably the most infamous crime in our town's recent history occurred. My mom broke the news to me, how a man had killed his wife, his kid, and then took his own life, before setting fire to the family home. I grew up in a real quiet mountain town, maybe only 3,000 people altogether, the kind of place where someone running a stoplight was gossip-worthy. Nothing ever happened there, so for something so awful to happen out of the blue, it rocked people to their very foundations. When Mom told me, I remember feeling awful for the wife and kid while wondering what the hell had gone so badly wrong in a man to make him something so unspeakable. But that wasn't the worst part. My mom knew who the family was. The kid that got killed was Annie, and her killer was her own stepfather. I was devastated, beyond devastated really, and it hit me harder because I felt like I'd known that he was bad. He acted all friendly and warm on the outside, but what I saw in Annie's room that night was a glimpse of a man he really was. Like I said, someone older might have been able to piece it together, but I just didn't have the emotional toolkit, so to speak, to do so, and in my mind, that meant Annie's death kind of felt partially my fault. I couldn't say that, though. I just bottled it all up, knowing that even if I had said something, nothing would have happened. It's not illegal to be a little strict or weird. That was my thinking anyway, but as I came to learn, that's not quite how the law works when it comes to kids. I should have said something. That's the moral of the story, really, and it's just as much a warning to others as it is a lesson to myself. If I'd have raised the alarm, even if it was voicing some minor concerns about the way Annie's stepdad acted with her at night, that would have gotten the ball rolling, meaning there was a good chance someone would have gotten around to asking him a few questions. And if that certain someone had been a 3-letter agency, and they'd looked through his computer, they'd have found a Pandora's box of vile, indecent images. Annie's stepdad was abusing her. He had been for years, and he's been documenting it too. Neighbors heard a whole bunch of shouting just before the murders and were right about to call the sheriff when they heard the first few shots. They said it sounded vicious, the argument, and that they were pretty sure someone was smashing things in between yells. It's not 100% clear, but people generally agree that the fight occurred after Annie's mom found the pictures or videos or whatever it was on her husband's computer. The way I imagine it is that all the smashing was either him smashing phones or him trying to stop Annie's mom from getting to one so she could call the cops. Then, when Annie's stepdad realized that there was nothing he could do or say to get Annie's mom to stop or calm down, he grabbed his gun and shot her, Annie, and then himself, after trying to destroy the evidence. He probably would have been successful if their neighbors hadn't heard the gunshots, because the cops that arrived on scene quickly summoned the fire department, who put out the blaze and preserved all the digital evidence in the process. The whole thing didn't come out for months and months afterwards, which I guess was a deliberate decision to try to keep people from freaking out too hard. But all it really did was divide all the grief and outrage into 2 parts. Hearing that Annie was being abused reignited the whole thing and had this big black cloud hanging over the town that never really went away. Me and my own family ended up moving out of town about 2 years later, and I did my final couple years of high school someplace else. When people figured out where I'd moved from, they kept asking if I'd known the girl who had been murdered by her stepdad. I used to lie and tell them I didn't, but every time they asked, I'd have to find an excuse to take a quiet moment in order to fight back the tears. I felt horrifically guilty for a long, long time, too, and it took a therapist to get me to understand that it wasn't my fault. But even so, I know there's a small part of me that will always feel partially responsible. It's all just a case of keeping that part's voice, the one that tells me it's all my fault, as quiet as possible.
Sometimes you need a bit of fun in your life, and certain people can definitely make it brighter. I'm talking about friends. Close friends. This story's been in the back of my mind for about 2 years now, and it's one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life that I really want to forget. It occasionally pops into my mind, and it still gives me the shivers to this day. It was the end of another school week, a Friday, and as a lot of us teenagers do, we decided to have a sleepover on the weekend. My friends agreed with me, and we happily walked home, talking about what we should do the next day and where we should go, and all that stuff that you'd expect to talk about. One of my other friends said that we should have a sleepover at his place. I'm not revealing their real names for privacy reasons, so for this story, I'll call them X and L. And in case you're confused, it was X that said he wanted us to sleep over at his place. I quietly walked home as I and L split up to go to our own houses to pack up our belongings for the sleepover. I grabbed out my bathroom equipment, sleeping bag, and fresh clothes, and all the other stuff you would need for a sleepover. Once I was finished packing my bag, I had called both X and L on our group chat, and told X that I had packed and I'd asked my parents if I was allowed to come, and told them they said yes, and L said the same thing as me. We were all excited, and X said that he'll be waiting at the park down outside his house to meet, since the park was only 2 houses down from his place. I casually walked to the park, which was approximately 10 minutes away. Right as we got there, I saw X and L already at the park. I gave them both a wave, and we all walked to X's house. We all got inside and made ourselves comfortable with our sleeping bags in the living room, because X's room was, well, a tad bit tiny. I think that the time was somewhere around 12:30 a.m. I remember it raining ever so slightly. We were all laughing and giggling about certain events that had happened at school that day, but I guess that isn't really relevant to the story. I told them that we should probably all go to sleep since it was extremely late and that I was really tired. Elle then replied, "Alright then, I guess it is a pretty shitty night after all." We had all started laughing at that response, and it eventually got to the point where we started talking less and less, and then eventually falling asleep from boredom. However, I didn't really fall asleep that night. I was rolling over in my bag and just trying to get into a comfortable position to sleep in, but had no luck falling asleep. I had my eyes wide open, staring at the blank ceiling. I looked at both X and L, who were both pretty wiped out into slumber. I got out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I possibly could, and then went into the kitchen to get a drink. But after I had my drink of water, I had heard some type of noise coming from a wall. I didn't really make it out at first, and I kinda had a difficult time trying to figure out what it was, and it was coming from the living room. I carefully went into the living room, and then tried my best not to step on L. I was standing in the middle of the room trying my best to find out where the hell the sound was coming from. Okay, to give you a bit of context, if you enter the front door of the house, the living room is in the first room that you enter, and the left side of the living room where you enter is a giant window. Well, the tapping sound was coming from that window. My heart was starting to speed up now, but what was the only logical option, you may ask? To look through the window. I told myself to just go up to the window and see what it was, so I proceeded to do so. I stopped. There was something else. The windows were closed by blinds. I leaned my ear closer to the window. Now, along with the tapping, I could also hear breathing. I could barely just hear it over the rain. Very slow breathing. I couldn't say anything. I very slowly backed away from the window. I frantically woke up both X and L in a panic. They both said to me, "What? What is it?" in a grainy, tired voice. I told them to shush themselves and to listen. However, the tapping and breathing soon stopped. Elle then said, "Dude, I don't hear a thing." I told them what I heard, but they didn't believe me. I was getting mad. But then Elle suggested, "Why don't you just go outside and check?" I immediately said something along the lines of, "Fine, I'll go out there. In fact, why don't you both come out with me just to be sure?" I opened the door quietly and motioned my friends to come outside with me. We got to the window outside the house, and nothing. There was nothing there. X said to me, "I told you, I knew there wasn't going to be anything there." We both talked about it for a bit outside, and X said I was crazy, but the story doesn't end there. Out of the blue, L nervously said, "Wait, who's that guy over there?" We all looked, and there was a dark silhouette that was just standing still a few houses down the street. He was probably about 5'5", and he was wearing a raincoat from what I remember. My friends both looked at me, knowing that I wasn't crazy. The guy was just staring at us, not moving a muscle, but he then started laughing in a sort of sinister kind of way. Within that moment, I said softly, "Go for the backyard gate, right now, do it." The guy continued to stare at us while we both slid slowly to the gate, which was very close. Suddenly the guy just full-on sprinted right toward us without warning. My life was in slow motion. I dashed for the gate. All of us got in, and I was actually the last one to get in, and then I locked the gate. The guy ran into the gate with such force, but the gate didn't budge. The gate and fence were really high, and he couldn't possibly get over it. He then started banging and screaming at the gate, yelling things like,
"Come on out here and I'll kill you, you dumb teenagers."
And I'll honestly never forget that sentence. We made a run for it to the back door of the house and woke X's dad up. He bolted straight outside and said the guy made a run for it and was already halfway down the street. He chased after him, screaming for him to get back here. X's dad called the police straight away. They arrived a little while later with cops. 3 searched the area while 1 stopped to talk to me about it. The 3 cops found nothing except for a long and sharp kitchen knife that was dropped outside the front lawn. I shuddered. One of the policemen asked me if I knew what he looked like, but I couldn't make anything out other than he was somewhere around 5'5" and wearing a raincoat. He wasn't seen again after that, and he hasn't come back. But the police that day said they found dirty boot marks right outside the front door. But the really creepy part about the boot marks outside the door is that apparently that door had a peephole, and that peephole could make you see through both ways. Plus X's house is old, and that guy was possibly spying on us through it. Moral of the story is be very careful during the night, because anything can happen if you're not careful.
Sleepovers have always been those special activities with friends and exist to have the purpose of a fun time. However, based on this story, it's clear that not all sleepovers end up being fun or exciting. This happened at my best friend's house a few years ago when we were still in middle school. For privacy reasons, I'll call her Megan. Megan was around my age and attended the same classes in school as me. Ever since then, we've become great friends where we mostly hung out just about every weekend. She was one of those friends who you could always count on and was just there to brighten your day. Anyway, this happened during winter break of 2018. Megan had invited me over to her house for a sleepover. Before I said yes, I had to get permission from my parents, and with them knowing Megan and I were best friends, they thankfully agreed. That night, my mom had drove me over to her house to drop me off. Megan had come from a very wealthy family, so she lived in a really nice house. You might as well consider it as a mansion. This would make the sleepover 10 times better, seeing as there would be more things to do. I got to her house with all of my clothes and utilities packed. Both Megan and her mom had greeted me, and we both went up to Megan's room where we watched a few movies and played some video games. About a couple hours into the stay, her mom had told us that she had been going out to dinner with a friend and wouldn't be back until late. Megan and I were both pretty mature for our age and told her we'd be fine until she got back. Her mom had given us $20 to order pizza, and with that, she went on her way. Not too long after, Megan had asked if I wanted to play hide and seek. Now, most people think that hide and seek is for younger children, but it comes back when you hit middle school. I agreed to it, and we had agreed that Megan would hide and I'd be the one seeking. Seeing as this house was huge, we decided we only play on the second floor to not make the game too hard. I gave her a good minute to hide while I said the all too common phrase, "Ready or not, here I come." Even though I was seeking on one floor, it was still pretty big with about 10 plus rooms to search. I start with Megan's room while looking under her bed, her closet, and even behind the door. However, she wasn't there, and I continue searching for her. I'd say I looked through several rooms by now, and that was when I noticed that one of the closets in the hallway had been slightly opened. I completely forgot about this as it was small and was a place most people wouldn't think to look. I casually walk over to the closet, and that's when I saw the glimpse of an eye peering in, staring right at me. At this point, I knew it was Megan, but I tried to make it seem like I didn't notice, as I wanted to give Megan a sort of scare when finding her. With that said, I opened the closet door, expecting to scare Megan, but instead saw this man staring back at me. His hair was a mess, and I saw craze straight through his eyes. But what really struck me the most was how he looked at me. It was almost as if he were guilty, as if he wasn't supposed to be caught. I scream at the top of my lungs as he runs past me down the stairs and out of the house. At that point, Megan had come to me and asked what was wrong, to which I told her that there was someone in the house and to call the cops. Thankfully, there was a police station down the road, so it didn't take long for an officer to arrive. After a thorough investigation, they had claimed that the man had probably found a way in due to the extreme weather. However, the man didn't get far. They had found him out in the backyard hiding behind one of the sheds. After all, it was snowing out and just needed someplace warm. Megan's parents decided to not press charges on him, but wanted a restraining order. Basically, he couldn't come near the house within 500 feet. The sleepover had been called off that night as my parents no longer felt comfortable. I remember my mom giving Megan and her family a bit of criticism, telling them how her mom could be so irresponsible leaving children alone. I wasn't invited back to their house again until my parents felt comfortable. Megan and I are still friends till this day and now work at a local supermarket. I'm still unsure as to what happened with that man, but I just hope he's getting the help he needs. This happened to a couple friends and I in our senior year of high school back in 2014. Back in high school, my friends and I were that dynamic trio you'd commonly see walking around campus that many people talk about. Anyway, this took place during the final months of high school, and because of this, we decided to do a sleepover to just relive our fun times. It was a Saturday night, and at one point during the sleepover, we had just finished a movie not knowing what else to do. Now, this was also around the time where social media had began to blow up. One of the social media apps that started gaining popularity quickly was Instagram, which eventually led to major trends. One of these trends was playing with an Ouija board in an attempt to contact spirits and other entities. There had been thousands of these videos uploaded to YouTube and Instagram about people attempting to connect with spirits. In fact, the trend got so popular that there were even tutorials on how to actually make contact. Being the naive and dumb teenagers we were, we had all looked at each other just knowing we had to do it. Thankfully, the parents of the friend hosting the sleepover just so happened to own a really old Ouija board that had been passed down from her family for years. She had claimed that it was 100% authentic and most likely worked, seeing how old it was. If anything, this was a plus as it would only add to the creepiness. We did some research online and found an article that described how to correctly set up an Ouija board. This involved some candles and a dark, quiet room. Once we got the supplies, we set the board down, lit the candles, and turned off all of the lights. For the first few seconds, nothing had happened, but that was until we felt the planchette slowly move to yes. We all look at each other, trying to figure out which one of us was moving it. However, we all denied and said that it was moving by itself. For some reason, one of my friends asked if it can somehow prove that there was something with us. All of a sudden, the craziest thing happens when we hear the sound of a toy piano being played in the other room. This instantly gave us a good scare, to which I then asked it a more serious question. Doing this was probably the stupidest decision I've ever made, and I still regret it till this day. I stupidly asked the board when I would die. With my hands on the planchette, it slowly moves to the letters TENSECONDS. 10 seconds. At this point, we all start staring at each other while laughing, thinking that one of us had to have done that. However, just about 15 seconds or so later, my phone starts ringing with the label emergency call. It was from my dad. I picked it up and was met with him screaming on the other end saying she's dead. She, meaning my mom. Apparently, they were on their way home from a dinner party when the car swerved off and got shoved into a boat trailer. My mom died instantly on impact while my dad only suffered from minor bruises. This incident has left me devastated for years, as I truly believe that this wasn't some coincidence.
I think we're going back many, many years for this, but I grew up in Northern California in quite a poor rural area. Some of my best friends from elementary and middle school lived like 10 to 15 miles away, so on weekends, instead of just going over to visit for the day, we'd have sleepovers to save our parents driving these crazy round trips. So I had this one friend called Star, whose parents were like old school hippies. Their house always smelled of patchouli. They were vegan before vegan was even really a thing, and aside from a few unusual recreational activities, they were basically just as good as being parents as any other couple. They were sweet, loving, and attentive, and I always had a ball whenever I went to sleepovers at their place, mainly because they'd let us stay outdoors in a tent at night, which was just such a huge adventure for a little group of preteen tomboys. Anyways, this one night we're staying in a tent in the backyard, but it was a backyard that extended to one side of the house. Where we're camped is in the view of the TV room window, so Star's mom and dad could keep an eye on us, but it also meant we could see the driveway from the flap of our tent. It was summertime, so it was still incredibly warm at night, so we ended up leaving the tent flat unzipped to let some cool air in. It obviously wasn't open all the way because bugs, but we can still see outside the tent. Then, in the middle of the night, Star shakes me awake and whispers, "There's someone in the driveway." I'm thinking it might have been her big brother, who was a few years older than us and was attending college. But when I suggested that, she said, "No, there's a bunch of people, look." I start getting real anxious hearing that, so I quietly creep up to the tent flap to peek out, and that's when I saw that Star was exactly right. In the little bit of moonlight that we had, I literally lost count of the number of people I saw creeping up her driveway. It was seriously one of the scariest moments of my life, mainly because there was absolutely nothing to do but keep as quiet as possible. We couldn't call the cops. This was way before cell phones. We couldn't warn Star's parents without revealing our presence. We were just powerless, forced to watch people who obviously didn't have good intentions slowly approaching Star's house. I think in the end, Star just broke, and in a move you could either call real brave or real stupid, she just ran out of the tent shouting, "Get away from my house," and then, "Mom, Dad, call the cops." As soon as she starts screaming, a bunch of flashlights burst into life, obviously held by the guy sneaking up the driveway. And oh my God, there were so many of them. At first glance in the darkness, it looked no more than about 5 or 6 people. But when they all turned their flashlights on, it was clear the number was more like 15 or 20. I just hear, "Sheriff's Department, show me your hands." And that was incredibly confusing because we were all about calling the cops to get help, but the cops were already here? Anyway, Star does as she's told, while me and our friends start climbing out of the tent with our hands in the air. That's when the person approaching us started saying, "Jesus, they're just kids, man." And with them being closer, I could see that they really were cops, with caps and badges and all patches on their arms, all that stuff. Then I hear, "Go, go, go, get in there." And the cops start bashing the front door to the house in while other cops fanned around the backyard and headed towards one of the barns. We were scared, obviously, but we're so focused on just staying down and watching that we're not really freaking out too bad. But when the cops start dragging Star's mom and dad out of the house and arresting them, she had to be restrained by the cop that was guarding us. After that, the cops drove me and our friend back to our respective homes. Then, I don't know what they did with Star. I think they took her to her grandma's or her aunt's or whatever. Then a few days later, we find out that Star's mom and dad had been growing something they shouldn't have in one of their barns. I get that it was illegal and stuff, but the aftermath was just so sad. Star had to go live with her relatives because her parents were sent off to prison for a few years. It was messed up. And I get that the cops were just doing their job and stuff, but it was definitely one of the scariest times of my life, seeing all those figures in black, just creeping towards my friend's house.
This story happened in the fall of 2017. My name is Nadia, and I was 27 years old back then. I live in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania, with my 2 friends Nicole and Christina. We rented a house together and shared the same car, which was a 2009 Lexus. My friends and I are very close and are like sisters. This arrangement would not have worked any other way. One day we wanted to go on a road trip together, so we decided to drive from Drexel Hill to another town called Butler. At first, things were going pretty well. Along the way, we would make stops to explore the countryside, take pictures, and enjoy the scenery. It was fall, and it got dark pretty quick. On top of that, our gas-guzzling V8 needed a refill, so we had no choice but to stop at a gas station. We spotted one in the middle of nowhere. Visually, this gas station looked creepy as hell. I thought it might have been abandoned when I first saw it. We pulled up next to a gas pump, and I was about to start filling the tank when a beat-up white van with tinted windows pulled into the gas station parking lot. As soon as I saw it, I immediately got a bad feeling. Christina had to go into the convenience store to use the bathroom. "Do you really have to go? This place looks sketchy as hell. It's an emergency. There's no need to be paranoid. I'll be quick." "Alright, just hurry up. Don't waste your time scrolling through your phone like you always do." Christina then went inside the store. As soon as she did, the driver exited the white van and followed her inside. My spidey sense told me that something was about to go down, so I decided to go inside as well. As soon as I walked in, I heard Christina screaming. The driver of the van was dragging Christina to what looked like a back door. I quickly got out my pocket knife and stabbed the man in the back. The man screamed and let go of Christina. I used the opportunity to grab Christina's hand and pull her to her feet. The man staggered and struggled to pull the knife out of his back. He was so angry that his face was red. He then let out a shout of pure rage and chased us out of the store. Luckily for us, we were able to make it back to the car. I put it into drive and drove out of there as quickly as possible. In my rearview mirror, I saw the white van from before pull out of the gas station parking lot and began to follow us. Fortunately for us, our Lexus had a more capable engine, so I put the pedal to the floor and we eventually lost him. His busted up kidnap mobile wasn't able to keep up. We went to the police station to file a report, but we never heard anything back. There were no employees present when all of this went down inside the store. And this was definitely the kind of place that may or may not have working security cameras. We were all pretty shaken up about this. It's not every day that you see one of your best friends literally being dragged away by a stranger. But thankfully, I was able to intervene and save her. This story happened to me when I was only 10 years old. I grew up in a popular suburb of Phoenix, Arizona. We lived in the third house on a street that was just off the neighborhood's main road. My house had an enclosed front porch with a basketball hoop and a bike rack. One day I was home by myself and decided to go to the local park. This was probably around 4 p.m. or so. At this time, our neighborhood wasn't fully developed, so having a lot of traffic wasn't common. My sister and I have always been paranoid about sketchy white vans because of the programs they showed us at school. So when I noticed one cruising down the main road, I thought it was strange, but I figured it might have been a construction worker and continued. I was one of those kids who would ride his bike around just to explore the area, so I was never too worried in my neighborhood. If someone did come after me, I knew all the best routes to lose someone. Anyways, I took my usual path and went down a side street through a cul-de-sac instead of the main road. When I arrived at the park, I noticed another neighborhood kid named Parker who was in the open field next to the playground. After a while of hanging out with him, I figured that my parents would probably be home from work by now. When I first left the park, I realized I had forgotten my water bottle. It was a tin Spider-Man water bottle, and that was a big deal to 10-year-old me. There was no way I was leaving that behind. After turning around, I was soon back at the hilltop overlooking the playground and the field. Parker was nowhere to be seen. I had been gone for maybe 30 seconds. I then saw the white van from before, parked on the side of the road near the playground. My heart sank once I saw Parker's bike lying on the ground next to the van with one of its wheels still turning. I froze up. I was pretty sure whoever was driving the van saw me. I quickly turned around and sped down the sidewalk and booked it home. Once I got back to my house, I made sure I didn't leave my bicycle by the front door or the porch. Instead, I threw it over the back gate so it wouldn't be visible from the road. After this, I rushed inside and locked the door. I was covered head to toe in sweat. After about 20 seconds of catching my breath, I decided to peer out through the peephole. And for a split second, my heart stopped. I could see the white van slowly making its way down the main road, driving past my street and out of sight. Now, at the time, I thought that Parker had been kidnapped and the white van was now hunting for me. And even now, I don't think that was an unreasonable conclusion to come to. But I would be lying to you if I said that there were reports of a missing child and the police were called in to investigate, and my parents had to stand next to me while I told a detective what I saw. But the truth is, I never saw Parker being pulled into the van. It is entirely possible that the driver could have said something to him, and he got scared and ran off without his bike. That wouldn't have made front page news, but I still feel like I would have heard about it. Honestly, I didn't know Parker that well. I saw him around the park sometimes, but I wouldn't say that we were friends. Point being, he could have moved away, or might have just been visiting. And as creepy as it was seeing that white van slowly driving down the road, it's unlikely they would be driving like that after just having kidnapped a child. I don't know what happened to Parker, because after that day, I never saw him or that white van ever again. The lesson here is to always be aware of your surroundings and to teach your kids to do the same, because you never know what could happen, even in the places where you feel the safest. I'm 19 and currently attending university. This encounter happened to me when I was in secondary school, around age 14 or 15. It was an IT lesson, so I was doing the usual, playing games and messing around with Instant Messenger, until the class was interrupted by 2 police officers. After the excitement died down, they proceeded to tell us that we needed to be careful. There was reports of a middle-aged man driving around this area in a white Toyota van, harassing girls around our age and telling them to come for a ride. A few days had passed since the police warned us. I would usually finish up at around 2:35 p.m., but I decided to stay later that day to catch up on some homework. So I left school around 4 p.m. Of course, when I got to the bus station, it had already left. The bus driver was a real jackass. So I decided to walk home. If only I had known what was going to happen that day, I would have called my mom to come pick me up. I would say the walk home was about 30 minutes. I was about 3/4 of the way home when I reached this long stretch of road that ran through a few fields with a small path alongside for bikes. This road was dark and had no streetlights. Since it was winter, it was already dark by this point. I was about halfway down the road. A few cars had passed me, but no big deal. That's when I saw some headlights approaching me. I didn't take much notice at first, as I assumed it was another passerby. That's when I see a white Toyota van slowly pass me and pull into a driveway that led to a farmhouse. This was about 200 meters in front of me, so I ended up walking past the van. I'm obviously on high alert by now. I hear the door swing open, and I turn around to see this tall, sketchy-looking man stepping out of the van and just stands there, staring at me. At this point, I'm ready to get the hell out of there, and I sprint to either the next farmhouse or the end of the road. But I quickly realized that these 2 options may be too far out of reach. I turn around again to see the man coming toward me. I bolted it as fast as possible. I was wearing one of those stupid pencil skirts we had to wear. I could hear the man running behind me. He was fast, too. The road was veering to the right. As soon as I got around the bend, I was out of sight for a few seconds. I literally threw myself into this large bramble bush and sat there hiding and waiting. A few moments go by, and he's nowhere to be seen. I was sure that he was right behind me, so after about 10 to 15 minutes, I thought it was safe to pull myself out of the bush. I was covered in scratches and scrapes. At the time, I didn't care. My main priority was hiding. I began walking down the road again. I was nearing the streetlights and my neighborhood, so I thought I would be okay. Until I saw the white van pass me again. I sprinted all the way back home, and as I got onto my road, I saw him passing by again, this time in the opposite direction. As soon as I got back, I told my parents, and they called the police and reported it. They didn't find him that night, but he was arrested a few days later, lurking outside our school, attempting to talk to the girl students again. I assume he was convicted, as I've never seen him again. Sometimes I still wonder what was going through his mind that night, and what would have happened if he got a hold of me. What exactly were his intentions? I think I know the answer, but it still makes my skin crawl. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at this place called the Pinecone Forest, which is what the neighborhood kids would call the small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off one of the trees to pass the time, waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework so we could play together. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a man came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He reeked of stale cigarette smoke. I was a bit scared to even look at him. He wasn't very old, but one of his eyes was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom taught me to be nice to people, so I faked a smile and said hello. "What you doing?" The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking bark off this tree." "You shouldn't do that. That's like picking off a tree's skin. How would you feel if somebody peeled off your skin?" He said this while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow fingernails. "I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then, Frankie's mother called me to the door and told me to come and wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time. Yesterday, when I was visiting my sister's house with my mom, watching my son and nephews play around in the yard, I remembered this encounter and brought it up to my mom. She had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe? She said it was probably time that I knew the whole story. She thought I had forgotten about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in is a small, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone there, and there was no reason for an outsider to be there, unless they were visiting someone. Anyway, this is what happened. Frankie's mom, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. She didn't recognize it, but figured that it was someone visiting one of her neighbors. Sonia later told the police that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it. She said it gave her a bad feeling. Her house had a huge window in front, facing the Pinecone Forest, and the van was parked next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van, while holding the phone just in case. She then saw the man exit the back of the van and walk up to me. As soon as she saw him grabbing my arm, she called the cops right away. It was then that she told me to come inside. The cops stopped the man outside the neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. The photos were of me at school, my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mom. But the story doesn't end there. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit, they found a cabinet full of knives. And I'm talking about a lot of knives in all shapes and sizes. There was also a few books on the human anatomy, obstetrical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of this unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrist and ankle straps. The entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrapping. Last my mom heard about him, he was locked away in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane.
As a background, I grew up in the suburbs of Sacramento, California, in an area that was very middle class and a place where it always felt safe. As a kid, I would walk home from school with the neighbors. We would play hide-and-go-seek, basketball on the streets, etc., and we never had any strange encounters. I am currently a 30-year-old male, and it is weird to think about this story. During the weekends when I was a teenager, I would ride my bike for hours at a time and ride around a 10-block radius from where my house was. In Sacramento, we typically had good weather in the spring, and a lot of the days were mild temperature with a decent amount of clear skies and sunlight. I'm a pretty introverted individual, and also pretty naive to things around me. I vividly remember one time when I was 13 years old and riding my bike in the neighborhood. I had a speedometer on my bike, and I always traveled around 12 to 16 miles per hour in the right-hand side bike lane of the street. While I was cruising on my bike, a windowless white van pulled up next to me on my left and matched my speed. I remember glancing over and thinking nothing of this since it is a neighborhood street and it would be weird if a van blazed by me at 35 miles per hour. Within a few seconds of the van matching my speed, the right side door slid open and there were two guys in the back and one guy driving. I look over and the van got uncomfortably close to me and one of the guys said quite loudly, "Get in the van." I didn't reply but started pedaling faster and reached about 18 miles per hour, which I know isn't very fast compared to a van and isn't going to get away from the van, but it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. The van accelerated to match my speed and I looked over at them. The van was weird on the inside. I remember seeing no seats in the back. The two guys were not seatbelted in. I remember seeing the metal flooring of the van and some rope. The guy beckoned, maybe in more of an insisting tone, to get inside his van. He reached out since I was within arm's distance. At this time we were traveling straight, but literally just as he was reaching out, the road we were on intersected with another street that I instinctively turned a hard right onto. They were forced to keep going straight, otherwise they would have flipped the van to follow me. I knew the area well and started weaving in between the residential streets that consisted of lots of curved roads that looped and resembled a maze. In hindsight, it was scary to be in that area because they could have easily found me as I couldn't have seen them coming up on me because of the curved roads, but luckily they didn't make another pass. Nowadays I look back and wonder what they had intended to do. Were they just goofing around? Were the ropes just for belaying and rock climbing, or did they actually have a malicious intent? Did they ever do anything to anyone else who couldn't get away? These questions still linger with me. I went home and never told anyone about it. To this day, only 2 people know about this, and now you. This happened to me when I was in high school. My family was going through some tough times and my mom and I would get into fights about money and social life. I felt I was doing more than enough for my age at that time, 16, going to school, working, giving her my paycheck for bills, and I was upset I wasn't allowed to go out on whatever little time off I did have. On her side, she felt that me going out would distract me from school, work, and I would pick up vices. One night, I got home from work and after a particularly heated argument, I couldn't take it anymore and just left the house. I didn't have a plan as to what I was going to do. In my mind, I just wanted to get away from my responsibilities, so I just started walking with no specific destination. I ended up walking for 2 hours. Despite walking for so long, though, I was only about 15 minutes from home because I was going in circles. By that time, it was 1 a.m., and I was walking on a sidewalk when a van pulled up in front of me and stopped on the side of the road. Now, this was on a populated area, on a 3-lane road just near the expressway, and there was mild traffic, so I didn't give it much thought. As I got closer to the van, though, I see that the driver rolls down the passenger side window and is looking at me through the side mirror. Still, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe somebody was lost trying to get directions. Now I'm right by the passenger door and the man calls me over. He said he was lost and was trying to get directions to the expressway. This is when I started feeling this wasn't right. The signs for the expressway were all around and the expressway was literally 2 blocks away. My mind started racing. I literally pointed at the expressway which was within sight and started to walk away when he started following me and asked me where I was going and if I needed a ride. At this point, I'm regretting not having gone home already. I turn towards the man and tell him that I don't need a ride, but thanks for offering, and start walking away faster. The man doesn't say anything and starts driving away, but as he passes me, I can see that he was looking at me through the side mirror again. Seeing him drive away, I started feeling relieved, but then instead of him going straight towards the expressway, he takes a right turn and goes down the street. Now I'm freaking out. I start thinking that I might go all the way around the block just to get back on the main road and come engage me again. So as soon as I see his van go out of sight, I book it to the building that was to my right and hide behind some bushes. The building had a bunch of offices, and I could see there was a lawyer's office, dentist's office, and other small businesses. I lay down on the ground and just waited. A couple of minutes passed, and through a small gap in the bushes, I see his van rolling up towards the main road. The man had done as I thought. He went around the block just to get back on the main road. I saw him driving slowly as he was looking for me, and then I saw him take that right turn again. I knew for sure he was looking for me again. Now, after a few minutes, his van shows up again, but it is driving slower and comes to a stop in front of the office building. After a few tense seconds in which I thought he would get out of the vehicle to check the area, he started to drive away. The whole time I was hiding behind the bushes, I was freaking out, knowing a stranger was actively searching for me. I waited about 5 minutes after I saw his vehicle drive off, and I took off running home. To this day, I don't know what his intentions might have been, but I believe in intuition, and mine told me that his motives were sinister. Last summer at approximately 3 a.m., I was returning home to my apartment in the sleeping district of Vilnius, Lithuania. Vilnius is a compact, neat town of about 500,000 people, and whatever nightlife there is, it happens only in the central district called the Old Town. Large suburbs full of Soviet concrete blocks can seem abandoned at night. My home is within a walking distance from the center, so for me it is completely normal to return home on foot, even at night. So I was walking down the completely empty street enjoying fresh nighttime air. Only occasionally I could see a car, almost always a taxi, and it was dead silence around. Then this white van appeared. I saw it quite far away, cruising at a slow speed in the first lane as if observing something. Then it steered into smaller lateral streets and stopped between two large blocks of flats some 50 meters from me. The van itself was old, beaten up and rusty. Similar ones are often used by small construction and relocation companies, only this one had no markings on it. The first door opened and out came a man in his 40s or 50s wearing non-specific clothes, jeans and some dark jacket. For several seconds he looked around cautiously, but I was too far away and in a non-illuminated area, so he either didn't notice or paid no attention to me. He ran around the van and stopped in front of a large old metal box that was fixed to the wall of a house nearby. You can see those boxes near all Soviet-area buildings, and I assume they contain distribution boards or some other electric equipment. As far as I know, those boxes are always locked. The van was blocking the box so that you couldn't see it from the street, but I was at a lucky angle and able to observe what happened. For a second or two, the man fiddled with the lock, opened the door, and took something out. Then he locked it and hastily ran back into the van, closing the rear door as the van was already moving. It slowly picked up speed and drove away. At this moment I remembered that it's not the first time I've seen this van. I actually saw it a lot at night, slowly driving around sleeping districts of Vilnius. I never paid attention to it, but still remembered it because there are very few cars at night. Strange, I thought. I told the story to several buddies, and we had a good laugh making up stories about secret drug distribution networks, spy messages, and stuff. I almost forgot it until last week. It was around 9:30 p.m. I was walking along the street separating the old town from the new town, right by the store belonging to large supermarket chains. There was a metal box on the wall. It was open, and a middle-aged man in builder uniform belonging to some construction company was squatting near it. When I noticed him, his hands were elbow-deep in the box. A woman of similar age wearing a uniform of the supermarket chain was standing nearby, looking at the man. There were a lot of people in the street, but at the time, I was the only one within listening distance of the two. Probably they were talking before I came near, and I could overhear the last words of the conversation. "So, they're coming to take it every night?" said the man. Aga, the woman answered. It was Russian for, uh-huh. The question was in Lithuanian, but since Vilnius has large Russian minority, bilingual conversations are somewhat commonplace. The man closed the box and locked it with a small, cheap-looking lock. Then they noticed me. The woman glanced at me rather angrily, turned around and disappeared between the doors of the store. The man walked away in the other direction. There was no goodbye. It looked as if though I disturbed them and they did not want to be seen here. I honestly don't know what it's all about, but I had several ideas. The most realistic one is that there is some low-level illegal stuff going on, such as people paying local criminals for protection by leaving money inside specific electricity distribution boards while thugs come and pick it up at night. But I clearly remember Builderman saying every night, which seems strange. Maybe people were stealing something. Money, goods, from their own workplaces in metal boxes and shady vans or some underground distribution and exchange network. I don't know, but any ideas would be helpful.